Tonight's story is a journey through one of the most misunderstood chapters in human history, the Dark Ages. A time of ruin and rebirth, faith and fear, silence and song. Over 15 parts, we'll walk through the fall of Rome, the rise of kings and monasteries, the storm of the Vikings, the quiet strength of women, the plague that changed the world, and finally, the dawn of the Renaissance. It's the story of how, even in centuries of darkness, the light of knowledge and compassion never went out. Welcome to History to Relax, where the past becomes a place of calm reflection. I'm so glad you're here. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below telling me where in the world you're listening from. It truly helps the channel grow and lets this calm little corner of history reach more people who need a peaceful story to fall asleep to. Now, find a comfortable spot. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the noise of the day drift away, because the story of the light within the Dark Ages is about to begin. Close your eyes and let's go back to a world where faith kept the flame alive through centuries of shadow until at last the light returned. Part 1, Twilight of Empire. When the last embers of the Roman world began to fade, few people living through those years understood what was truly ending. The legions had already grown thin, the marble statues were chipped by wind and rain, and the once orderly roads had begun to crack beneath the weight of neglect. Yet for centuries, Rome had been the sun around which so many lives revolved, its power, its law, its promise of stability, and then, slowly, that light began to dim. Imagine standing on a quiet hilltop somewhere in late 5th century Italy. Below, the ruins of an old Roman villa lie half buried in ivy. The tiled roof has fallen in, but the mosaic floors still glimmer faintly through the dust. The air smells of wet earth and wood smoke. A shepherd passes where once senators debated. A world built on marble and discipline has softened into one of fields, fog, and forgotten roads. To those alive then, the fall did not come with thunder. It was more like the slow draining of color from a painting. A tax collector no longer arrived. The local bathhouse closed. A watchtower remained unmanned. Trade caravans grew rare, and coins became strange curiosities passed hand to hand with quiet wonder. The change crept like winter frost, unnoticed until everything familiar had vanished beneath it. In cities such as Rome and Constantinople, the news spread unevenly. Some still spoke Latin in their courts, still sealed their letters with imperial wax. But far from the capitals, farmers and villagers measured time by the seasons, not by emperors. The empire had been too vast, too intricate, and its unraveling took generations to complete. Even as the western half crumbled, the eastern half, the Byzantine world, continued to glow, a reminder that the idea of Rome would not truly die, only shift its shape. For those who depended on its order, however, the change was profound. Roman law had once woven together the lands of Europe like an invisible net. When that net tore, every region drifted. Roads decayed, markets emptied. The language of learning, Latin, retreated into monasteries and scriptoria. Knowledge became fragile, carried in memory rather than libraries. People sought safety behind walls, in families, or in faith. There were still rulers and kings, of course, but their power was local, born of necessity rather than ambition. They ruled from wooden halls rather than marble palaces, surrounded by retainers whose loyalty was as uncertain as the harvest. Across the old provinces, new peoples moved in. Goths, Vandals, Lombards, Franks. They brought their own gods, customs, and hopes, blending them with what remained of the Roman spirit. Out of that uneasy mix, something new began to take root. For centuries, Rome had been a machine of stone and discipline, but the world that followed was human again, vulnerable, inconsistent, tender in its fear. The old grandeur was gone, yet in the ashes, smaller fires began to glow. In remote valleys, farmers learned to grow barley where wheat once stood. In ruined villas, families built cottages out of fallen bricks, and in the silence of abandoned temples, prayers took new forms. The word dark would be used much later to describe this age, but to those who lived through it, it was simply life. Days were filled with work and worry, with hunger, with fleeting joys. They did not see darkness, they saw the rhythm of seasons, the patience of the soil, and the faint promise that tomorrow might still come. The sun rose as it always had, even if its light revealed a changed world. As Rome's statues cracked, new voices echoed in stone churches. Monks copied worn manuscripts by candlelight, their breath misting in the cold air of mountain monasteries. Bells called the faithful from distant fields, their sound carrying across fog-filled valleys. The empire of roads and soldiers had ended, but another empire, one of faith and endurance, began to rise quietly in its place. If you walked through a ruined forum at dusk, you might hear the wind whisper through broken columns, carrying fragments of a vanished language. A few travelers would pass, cloaked against the chill, following old paths toward small villages where light still burned behind shutters. That faint light, fragile yet enduring, was the true legacy of Rome. Not its walls or conquests, but its persistence in memory, its belief that order could return. The Twilight of Empire was not only the end of power, it was a transformation of meaning. Humanity was learning painfully how to live without the guarantees of greatness. The cities that once ruled the world now slept under vines and moss. And from that sleep, a new world slowly dreamed itself into being. In time, the Dark Ages would earn a name that implied loss and ignorance. But beneath that label lay resilience, a quiet defiance against chaos. People tilled soil, told stories, and kept the faith that the world could be rebuilt. Even in the longest night, small lights remained. And when history looks back, it sees not only what was lost, but what was kept alive. The story of the Dark Ages begins here, in the twilight where one world fades and another, uncertain and trembling, begins to rise. Part 2, A World Without Rome. When the empire's banners finally disappeared from the western provinces, the world did not end in fire. It simply grew quiet. The marble cities that had once echoed with the tramp of soldiers and the hum of markets began to fall still, their silence broken only by the wind. Yet beyond the ruined walls, people kept living, planting, building, raising children, and learning once again how to survive without the machinery of empire. In a small valley somewhere in Gaul, a man wakes before dawn. His house is built from stone scavenged from a fallen Roman bathhouse, the corners of old columns now forming the base of his hearth. The air is cold, and the smoke from his fire hangs thick and low. He stirs the embers, adds a few splinters of pine, and waits for the faint crackle of warmth to return. Outside, his wife milks the goats. Their breath rises as mist in the half-light, mingling with the morning fog that rolls down from the hills. This is how life looked for most in the centuries after Rome's fall. Slow, seasonal, bound to the earth. The rhythms of empire had vanished. Now the rhythm of weather ruled. People measured time by harvests, by lambing, by the first frost. They lived close to the soil, and the soil gave just enough to keep them alive. The Roman roads still cut across the landscape, but few dared to travel far. Bandits hid among the ruins, and forests reclaimed the old routes. Traders who once brought olive oil and glassware from the south now sold coarse pottery and salted meat at small fairs. Coins were scarce, barter returned. A sack of grain might buy a pair of shoes. A day's labor could pay for a clay pot. In the absence of empire, the old order dissolved into countless small worlds. Each village was its own center of gravity, a cluster of huts surrounded by fields, guarded by a wooden palisade and a watchfire. Loyalty turned inward. Families and clans became more important than provinces or kings. People found security in numbers they could count, faces they could name. The land itself was changing. Forests crept back over long-abandoned estates. The marble villas of senators became quarries for common homes. Columns were toppled and carved into millstones. Statues were broken apart for lime. It was not destruction out of malice, but necessity, the slow recycling of an old world into a new one. From Rome's grandeur, villagers built their kitchens and barns. Civilization had not died, it had been repurposed. At the heart of each settlement stood the church. Sometimes it was little more than a wooden hut with a cross on the roof. Sometimes it was a stone chapel built from the remains of a temple. Here, people gathered not only to pray but to learn news, to trade, and to find comfort when famine or sickness struck. The priest was often the only man who could read, and his words carried the weight once reserved for governors. The authority of the empire had splintered into the moral power of faith. Still, the memory of Rome lingered. In songs and stories, old names were whispered: Caesar, Legion, Empire. Travelers who came from far away spoke of Constantinople, the shining city in the east where emperors still ruled under gilded domes. To those in the west, that world seemed as distant as the moon. Their nights were long and dark, their fears close and familiar. Wolves in the forest, hunger at the door, disease that crept through the winter air. Yet within these hardships lay a strange stability. The people of the post-Roman world learned endurance. They built smaller, sturdier lives. A good harvest was a celebration, a surviving child was a miracle. Communities became families of families, bound by shared labor and shared faith. The fragility of life gave it a quiet sanctity. To live another day was to triumph. The language of Latin faded on their tongues, replaced by local dialects, the early roots of French, Italian, and Spanish. Each valley began to sound different, each people to think of themselves as distinct. Identity no longer flowed from the emperor's decrees, but from the land beneath one's feet. A new Europe was being born, one village at a time. Imagine walking through one of those villages at dusk. The fields glow gold under the setting sun. The air smells of smoke and hay. A blacksmith hammers softly, shaping iron into nails. Children chase a tired chicken through the mud. From the chapel comes the low hum of an evening prayer. The world feels small but whole, enclosed within the circle of light that spills from the doors and windows. Outside that glow lies forest, mystery, and fear, but within it there is belonging. When storms came, they came hard. Crops failed. Floods carried away bridges that no one remembered how to rebuild. In those moments, faith deepened. The people prayed not for glory or conquest, but for survival. Saints and relics became protectors, their stories carried from mouth to mouth by traveling monks. The idea of miracle was not fanciful, it was a necessity, hope made tangible in a world too uncertain to promise tomorrow. Occasionally, a stranger arrived, a soldier without an army, a wandering bard, a holy man seeking solitude. They brought news of distant lands, of kings rising in the north, of raids across the sea, of Rome's forgotten treasures buried beneath new cities. These tales reminded villagers that the world was still wide, even if they could no longer see its edges.
Over generations, a quiet order emerged again. Landowners became lords, free men became serfs. The first outlines of feudal life took shape, not through grand design but through the slow negotiation between power and protection. In exchange for safety, people gave labor. In exchange for loyalty, they received land to till.
It was a rough balance, but it worked. A web of oaths instead of laws, of personal ties instead of imperial decrees. The result was a patchwork world, dozens of small kingdoms and countless local rulers, each claiming a sliver of authority. Yet beneath that complexity lay a simple truth: life continued. Fields were plowed, children were born, fires burned through the long winters. Civilization, though dimmed, had not gone out. It had merely shifted its light from palaces to hearths. Some nights, the villagers still gazed toward the horizon where the remnants of Rome lay hidden. Broken aqueducts spanned valleys like the ribs of ancient beasts. Old milestones marked forgotten roads. To them, these ruins were not reminders of loss, but of endurance, proof that even great things could crumble and yet leave behind a shape for new life to follow. The world without Rome was smaller, rougher, and often cruel. But it was also more human. It forced people to depend on one another, to rebuild community from the ground up. From that soil of hardship grew the roots of everything that would come after: the kingdoms, the cathedrals, the spark of learning that would one day reignite the West. And so the story of the Dark Ages continued, not as an age of pure darkness, but as one of flickering light. In every village candle, every prayer whispered against the wind, the legacy of Rome survived in spirit. A world without empire had not become empty. It had simply begun again, humbler but enduring, guided by the same quiet faith that light would return. Part 3. The Forgotten Roads. The Roman world had once been a network of veins and arteries, stone paths pulsing with life. Across them marched armies, merchants, couriers, and pilgrims. From the misty isles of Britannia to the deserts of Syria, one could travel without ever losing sight of Rome's order. Each milestone carved in stone whispered the same promise, that no matter how far one wandered, civilization would follow. But after the fall, those roads began to empty. At first, they decayed quietly. Grass pushed through cracks once swept clean by legionary boots. Weeds grew where wagons had rumbled. The milestones still stood, but their inscriptions faded, their Latin words eroded into mystery. The hum of traffic, carts creaking, hooves striking, voices calling in many tongues, fell away until only birds and the wind remained. The empire had built a map of stone, but time and neglect began to erase it. For those who still traveled, the journey became uncertain. A merchant setting out from the ruins of a Roman town might pass under a collapsed arch and find the road ahead swallowed by forest. Bridges had fallen, rivers changed their course. Bandits roamed where soldiers once stood guard. Every valley held its own ruler now, every pass a toll, every crossing a risk. To move between worlds was to gamble with one's life. Imagine walking along one of those ancient roads in the 7th century. The sky is gray and rain pools in the hollowed ruts of forgotten wagons. Moss clings to the stone edges, slick underfoot. On either side, the forest presses close, tall oaks and tangled undergrowth where once there had been farms. Occasionally, you glimpse fragments of the past, a half-buried milestone, a broken statue face down in the mud, the curve of a crumbling aqueduct above the trees. Each is a ghost of memory, a reminder of how far the world has drifted from its former order. For centuries, people avoided these roads. They had become dangerous corridors between the safety of villages. The forest was alive with rumors, spirits, thieves, wild beasts. Only the brave or the desperate dared to travel. Messengers rode with crucifixes hanging from their saddles. Pilgrims walked in groups, praying aloud as they crossed desolate stretches. The once proud empire's gift of connection had become a shadowed maze of fear. Yet some refused to let the roads die. Monks, traders, and wanderers took up the task of rebuilding faint threads of contact. Slowly, inns appeared beside rivers and crossroads. These hospitia offered a bed of straw, a bowl of soup, and a fire for travelers, simple comforts, but enough to keep movement alive. From monastery to monastery, networks of hospitality formed like quiet lanterns across the darkened landscape. The monks who traveled between these sanctuaries were the first map makers of the new world. They carried not swords but parchment, drawing crude sketches of valleys and coasts. Their routes were guided by memory, rumor, and faith. And though their maps were small and uncertain, they represented a reawakening, the faint rediscovery of geography in a world that had forgotten how to measure itself. Still, the average person rarely left the boundaries of home. A man born in a valley might live and die within sight of the same hills. A woman might never see a river beyond her own fields. The world had shrunk to what could be reached on foot before sundown. To travel far was not only dangerous, but unnecessary. Life revolved around the local, the Lord's manor, the church bell, the harvest fair. Distance became myth. Beyond the familiar lay stories of dragons, spirits, and lands where the sea poured over the edge of the earth. And yet, even in their isolation, people remained curious. The traveling peddler was greeted like a visitor from another world. When he arrived, children gathered to see the strange objects in his pack: a comb of bone, a vial of foreign oil, a piece of colored glass. His tales of distant towns and kings carried the fragrance of wonder. In exchange for a few eggs or a loaf of bread, he gave the gift of imagination. The roads also carried ideas. A monk from Ireland might meet a scholar from Italy in a Frankish monastery, their conversation weaving together fragments of lost knowledge. The routes that had once carried legions now bore pilgrims seeking relics and merchants bringing salt or wool. Slowly, the old lines began to stir again. The roads were no longer highways of empire, but lifelines of faith and survival. There is a quiet beauty in this transformation. The roads that had once served conquest now served communion. Where generals once marched to expand dominion, barefoot pilgrims now walked to find meaning. Their steps, gentle but persistent, reawakened Europe's sense of movement. In this way, faith replaced empire as the glue of the continent. The journey itself became a sacred act. Still, danger never fully left the path. Wolves haunted the forests. Raiders struck from hidden trails. At dusk, travelers lit small torches and prayed to reach the next settlement before nightfall. When they did, they would find safety in the faint ring of light cast by a hearth fire, a reminder that human warmth was still the greatest fortress in a darkened land. As generations passed, the roads acquired layers of legend. Some were said to be cursed, haunted by the ghosts of lost legions or by travelers who never reached home. Others were lined with shrines, each offering protection to those passing by. Travelers left tokens, a coin, a sprig of herbs, a whispered prayer, as though paying toll to unseen guardians. The empire's bureaucracy had been replaced by superstition, but in its own way it still maintained the idea of order through ritual. Trade eventually returned, though modestly. Salt, furs, wine, and grain began to flow again between valleys. Markets reappeared in town squares. With every exchange came conversation, rumor, and learning. The roads, though broken, still bound people together. Each step, each wagon wheel, was a declaration that isolation would not win. For a moment, imagine yourself standing at the intersection of two such roads at dawn. Mist drifts low across the fields, and the sound of a bell echoes from a distant monastery. A traveler appears on the horizon, cloaked, weary, but purposeful. Perhaps he carries letters from a distant lord, or a message of peace, or a relic to a shrine. Behind him stretches the old road, cracked but still visible, winding toward the memory of Rome. Ahead lies uncertainty, yet he walks on. That single step forward is the spirit of the Dark Ages, the quiet insistence that life and movement must continue. By the 9th century, many of these forgotten roads would be reborn. Stone bridges would rise again. Markets would flourish. Kings would claim dominion over lands once lawless. But in these early centuries of darkness, it was the persistence of travel, slow, fearful, faithful, that kept the world connected. Every candle carried across a mountain pass, every shared meal between strangers, every pilgrim song whispered under the stars, these were the threads from which Europe wove its new beginning. So the roads were never truly forgotten. They slept, waiting. And when the world was ready to walk again, they opened once more beneath tired feet, scarred but still leading forward. Part 4. Faith in the Ruins. When the old empire collapsed, its marble pillars toppled and its armies vanished into history, only one structure remained standing across the wreckage, the invisible architecture of faith. It was built not from stone or bronze, but from hope, fear, and ritual. In the silence that followed Rome's fall, faith became the new language of survival. The church did not arrive in the Dark Ages fully formed. It grew quietly from the ashes, one prayer, one candle, one manuscript at a time. Monks and priests filled the empty spaces where governors once ruled. Their voices replaced the decrees of emperors. Their monasteries rose where bathhouses had cooled and temples crumbled. For a people adrift in uncertainty, the church became the single constant, a lighthouse in the fog. In a small village surrounded by forest, the church bell rang at dawn. It was a simple sound, but to those who heard it, it meant everything. It marked the rhythm of the day: work, rest, worship. When that bell tolled, even the wind seemed to pause. Farmers straightened from their fields. Children crossed themselves as they looked toward the steeple. The faith of the early medieval world was not abstract. It was woven into every act of life. Inside, light filtered through narrow windows. Smoke from tallow candles curled toward the rafters. The scent of beeswax and incense filled the air. A wooden crucifix hung above a stone altar, worn smooth by generations of fingers that had touched it in prayer. The priest's Latin chants were mostly unintelligible to his flock, yet their rhythm was enough. The sound itself was sacred, a bridge to something beyond comprehension. People came to the church seeking protection from more than sin. They came for healing when sickness spread, for food when the harvest failed, for shelter when raiders approached. The priest kept not only the keys to the chapel, but the keys to knowledge. He could read, he could write, he could interpret the will of God and the letters of distant kings. In a world without bureaucracy, faith filled the space of government. Monasteries became fortresses of order amid chaos. Their thick walls enclosed gardens, workshops, and scriptoria where monks bent over parchment by the light of oil lamps. The scratching of quills on vellum was the sound of civilization refusing to die. There, ancient wisdom survived, not out of ambition, but devotion.
The monks copied texts line by line, scripture, philosophy, even fragments of Roman law and science. Their careful hands carried the memory of the world forward.
Imagine such a place in the heart of winter. Snow falls outside, muffling the sound of the river. Inside, a monk dips his quill into ink made from oak galls. His robe is rough wool, his fingers tremble in the cold. Each letter he writes is a prayer, a small act of defiance against forgetfulness. He may never leave the monastery walls, but his words will travel farther than any king's messenger. Through such men, the past whispered into the future. Faith also reshaped the landscape. Where Roman statues had stood, wooden crosses now rose. Shrines appeared along roads, each marking a place where a miracle was said to have occurred. Wells were blessed, springs became holy, groves became sanctuaries. Every corner of the land held a story of a saint who healed the sick, of a relic that glowed in darkness, of a voice heard in dreams. For people who had lost the security of empire, the sacred was a new kind of map, one that promised meaning where none could be seen. Pilgrimages became a lifeline of motion through the stillness of the age. Men and women left their homes to walk to distant shrines, carrying offerings of bread, flowers, or a lock of hair. They slept under hedgerows, shared crusts with strangers, and followed roads that wound through forgotten valleys. Each step was both journey and prayer. The pilgrim's staff and shell became symbols of faith's persistence, reminders that even in a fractured world, people still sought connection with the divine. The stories of saints spread like seeds on the wind. There was Saint Martin of Tours, who cut his cloak in half to share with a beggar. Saint Benedict, who wrote his simple rules for a life of discipline and prayer. St. Patrick, who brought light to the misted hills of Ireland. These figures became heroes in a time that had lost its emperors. Their miracles replaced the myths of old gods, their compassion replaced conquest. For ordinary people, heaven was not a distant abstraction. It was a promise that the suffering of this world had meaning. Each candle lit for a lost child, each whispered Ave Maria, each procession through the rain. These were acts of endurance, a quiet rebellion against despair. The peasants who knelt in the mud outside their chapels were not ignorant. They were practicing hope. Even nature seemed drawn into faith's rhythm. Fields were blessed in spring, flocks in autumn. The calendar of saints became the calendar of seasons. Festivals that once honored pagan gods were transformed into holy days, Christmas for Saturnalia, Easter for the rebirth of spring. The church did not erase the old traditions, it absorbed them, giving ancient joy a new vocabulary. The continuity soothed people's fears. Though Rome was gone, the wheel of the year still turned, and with it came renewal. There was power in this faith, and not only spiritual. Bishops became rulers, abbots became lords. The church owned land, minted coins, and sent emissaries across kingdoms. Kings sought its blessing to legitimize their crowns. Yet at its heart, faith in the Dark Ages remained deeply human. It was less about doctrine than survival, a shared belief that life, however fragile, was sacred. Sometimes, faith itself became the only form of art. The illuminated manuscripts of the period, pages glowing with gold and color, were more than decoration. They were prayers made visible, attempts to bring beauty into a world that often seems starved of it. The monks who painted those intricate designs of vines and beasts were not merely preserving words, they were expressing wonder. To gaze at such age was to glimpse eternity through ink and light. Beyond the monasteries, hermits sought solitude in caves or on windswept islands. They believed that by withdrawing from the world, they could intercede for it. Their isolation was both punishment and offering. Villagers sometimes climbed the hills to leave food for them, hoping their prayers might bring good weather or peace. These solitary figures became legends, living bridges between earth and heaven, reminders that faith could thrive even in desolation. And so, while the political map of Europe fractured into chaos, the spiritual map grew stronger. Across the ruins of the Roman provinces, a vast web of belief stretched, fragile yet enduring. Its language was prayer, its borders drawn in light. At night, when wolves howled beyond the walls, families gathered round the hearth. The father told the children stories of saints who tamed beasts, of angels who guarded the faithful in their sleep. The mother traced the sign of the cross on their foreheads before they closed their eyes. Outside, darkness ruled, but within those small circles of warmth, the world still held meaning. Faith was not an escape from hardship, it was the courage to face it. The villagers who planted their fields, the monks who copied their scrolls, the pilgrims who walked until their feet bled, all carried the same belief that suffering was temporary and that even the smallest life was seen by God. When dawn came, the church bell rang again. Smoke rose from chimneys. The wheel turned once more. The empire was gone, but something deeper had taken its place, not the rule of law, but the rule of belief, holding the fragments of civilization together through centuries of shadow. Faith had become the bridge between worlds, between the fallen grandeur of Rome and the fragile dawn of what would come next. In the ruins, humanity found its voice again, quiet but unbroken. Part 5: Barbarians and Brothers. The fall of Rome was not a single event. It was a tide, and the tide brought with it new peoples, new tongues, new gods. To those who lived through it, they were called barbarians, a word born in fear, echoing the foreign syllables of strange languages. But history, when seen through gentler eyes, tells a different story. These were not only destroyers, they were also inheritors, builders, and brothers in the long reshaping of a world in ruins. The Romans had named them long ago Goths, Vandals, Lombards, Franks, Saxons, and countless smaller tribes whose names have vanished like smoke. They came from the forests and plains beyond the Rhine and Danube, driven by hunger, by cold, by curiosity, and sometimes by the push of other migrating peoples behind them. To the crumbling empire, they were invaders, but to themselves, they were seekers of land, safety, and belonging. Imagine the world from their eyes, endless forests stretching to the horizon, rivers that glitter like steel, skies low and gray with winter. They traveled in wagons and on foot, whole families together, warriors, mothers, children, herds of cattle, carts piled with carved wooden gods. They followed faint trails through the ruins of Roman roads, setting their tents beside the bones of empire. What they saw were cities half abandoned, fields untended, and walls left undefended. It was not conquest as much as inheritance of a world that had already lost its strength. In the year 410, when the Visigoths under Alaric entered Rome, the world trembled, but even they did not burn the city in vengeance. They looted, yes, but with restraint, as though awed by the weight of what they found. For 3 days, the eternal city, which had ruled continents, echoed with the sound of foreign footsteps. Then the Goths moved on, carrying their spoils and their memory of marble streets into southern lands. The sack of Rome was a symbol, but it was also a beginning, the moment when the torch of history passed, unwillingly, to new hands. The Vandals crossed to Africa and founded a kingdom on the shores where Roman legions had once drilled. The Lombards descended into Italy, their long beards giving them their name. The Angles and Saxons sailed across the cold North Sea to Britain, carving fields out of forest and marsh. The Franks settled along the rivers of Gaul and slowly began to weave the threads of what would become France. The old empire did not fall into nothing. It became a mosaic of new realms. These newcomers brought their own laws, oral traditions of honor and vengeance, of oaths sealed by blood rather than paper. Their leaders ruled by charisma and by sword. In their wooden halls, kings drank from cups of horn while poets sang of battle and loyalty. It was a world rougher than the marble courtyards of Rome, yet in its rawness lay vitality. Over time, the barbarians did not destroy Roman culture. They absorbed it. They learned Latin to speak with priests and merchants. They adopted Roman coinage, even if they stamped it with their own faces. Many embraced Christianity, finding in its promise of salvation something that resonated with their warrior's heart, a God who was both merciful and mighty. Faith was the bridge. Missionaries crossed frontiers as fearlessly as soldiers. St. Patrick carried it to Ireland, St. Augustine to England, St. Boniface to the German forests. They built wooden churches where oak groves had once been sacred to the old gods. The cross replaced the runestone, yet echoes of the old beliefs lingered. The spirits of rivers and trees lived on beneath the names of saints, and the feasts of the solstice became Christmas under new light. The blending was not smooth, but it was inevitable. In the great melting of cultures, a new Europe began to take shape, part Roman, part Germanic, part Christian, and wholly human. The Franks were among the first to understand that power needed unity. Under King Clovis, they built a kingdom that stretched across much of Gaul. Clovis himself converted to Christianity after a desperate battle. When facing defeat, he prayed to the Christian God and found victory instead. His baptism became a turning point. From that moment, the church and the Frankish kings became entwined. The faith of the old empire found new guardians among the people once called its enemies. The Goths and Lombards followed similar paths. They founded cities, wrote laws, and minted coins. They married local women, adopted Latin names, and sent their sons to monasteries to learn. Within 2 generations, they were no longer outsiders, but rulers. The lines between Roman and barbarian blurred until they no longer mattered. A child born in those lands might speak a language born from both worlds, pray in Latin, and wear a brooch carved in the old tribal style, living proof that history does not end but transforms. Still, the process was not without violence. Wars were frequent. Borders shifted like tides. Whole villages burned. In the cold light of dawn, the dead were buried in shallow graves, and the living began again. Yet even through such cruelty, a kind of progress moved quietly beneath the surface. Each rebuilt home stood upon the stones of the last, and with each generation, the foundations of the medieval world deepened. In the countryside, Roman villas crumbled into fields, but their walls sheltered new lives. A Vandal farmer plowed where a senator once dined. A Frankish child played with a coin that bore the profile of a long-dead emperor. In the cities, old amphitheaters became marketplaces and temples became churches. The barbarians did not erase the past, they recycled it. In their hands, the fragments of empire became the building blocks of something new. Imagine walking through one of these early medieval towns. The streets are narrow and crooked, lined with huts built from timber and thatch beside crumbling Roman walls. Smoke rises from hearths. The air smells of wood fire and tanned leather. A priest in rough robes blesses a newborn as a warrior sharpens his sword on the steps outside. Above them all, a bell tolls from a church tower that was once a Roman watchtower. The world has changed, yet it feels alive again. The fusion of blood and belief began to produce something remarkable: identity. People started to call themselves Franks, Lombards, Saxons, or Christians rather than Romans. Their pride was local, rooted in soil and ancestry, but held together by the shared thread of faith. 1,000 small kingdoms rose and fell, but beneath their rivalries ran a common sense of belonging to a story larger than any tribe. The word barbarian lost its sting. The men and women who had once been feared as destroyers became rulers, builders, and saints. Out of the chaos of migration came the foundations of nations. Out of the rough poetry of their sagas came new languages. Out of their courage came the courage of Europe itself, the ability to survive, to adapt, and to endure. By the 8th century, the grandsons of those once called barbarians sat upon thrones, wore crosses, and ruled with laws written in Latin. Their scribes preserved the memory of both worlds, the strength of the warrior and the wisdom of the monk. The empire was gone, but its heart still beat, faintly yet faithfully, in the halls of these new kings. When night fell, the fire burned in every settlement. Around it sat people whose ancestors had fought against Rome, now speaking the words of its faith. They told stories of gods turned to saints, of battles won by prayer, of lands found and lost. The children who listened would inherit not ruins, but roots. History would later call this the Dark Ages. But to those who lived in them, it was a time of rebirth, rough, imperfect, and full of light breaking through cracks. The barbarians had not brought an end to civilization. They had carried its fragments on their backs across mountains and rivers and planted them anew. Out of ruin came renewal. Out of chaos, community. And in the meeting of barbarians and brothers, Europe began to breathe again. Part 6. The Village Life. As the dust of conquest settled and kingdoms began to take shape, Europe's heartbeat slowed to the rhythm of the soil. Power might have shifted between kings and warriors, but for most people, life unfolded in the narrow circle of the village, a world small enough to walk across in an hour, yet vast in the depth of its meaning. It was in these humble places that the foundations of the new age were laid day by day through the ordinary work of survival. The early medieval village was both fragile and enduring. It stood where forests had been cleared or where Roman villas had long ago collapsed into rubble. The buildings were simple, timber frames packed with wattle and daub, thatched roofs that smoked gently in the rain. Around them lay gardens, pig pens, and uneven fences made from branches. A few narrow paths wound toward the fields beyond. In the center stood the church, modest yet proud, its bell, a voice that could call the entire community to prayer or warning in a single sound. Life here was communal. No one stood alone, for solitude meant death. Every task was shared: plowing, harvesting, weaving, repairing roofs. The people knew one another's faces, faults, and stories. They were bound together not by law, but by necessity, by the understanding that survival depended on cooperation. Above them all, on a low rise or small hill, stood the manor, the residence of the local lord. It was not yet the grand castle of later centuries, but a fortified hall built of heavy wood and surrounded by a ditch or palisade. From this hall the lord ruled his tiny domain, commanding a handful of soldiers, collecting rents, and administering justice. His authority was both protection and burden. He owed loyalty to a greater lord or king, yet his first duty was to the land that sustained him and his people. The feudal bond was personal, a network of oaths linking every man and woman, from serf to sovereign, in a chain of obligation. At dawn, the village stirred. Roosters crowed, and the thin gray smoke of morning fires rose through the mist. In the fields, oxen were yoked to heavy wooden plows. Their breath steamed in the cold air as they strained against the earth, guided by men whose hands were calloused and raw. The soil was dark and heavy, and every furrow was a small victory wrested from nature. Farming was slow and hard, but it was the heartbeat of life. Without the harvest, there was no bread, no ale, no future. Women worked beside the men, tending gardens and gathering herbs along the hedgerows. They brewed, baked, and spun, turning flax into thread and wool into cloth. Their hands shaped the rhythm of home, kneading dough, stirring pots, rocking infants. Children helped as soon as they could walk, chasing birds from the fields or carrying bundles of sticks for fuel. Play was rare and brief, stolen between chores. The seasons rule all. Spring brought hope and anxiety. Would the seeds take root? Would the rains come at the right time? Summer was labor. Autumn was reckoning. Winter was endurance. The year was a wheel that turned endlessly, marked by feast days and fasts.
The church calendar and the farming calendar were one and the same: Lent before planting, harvest festivals at Michaelmas, candles at midwinter. Each event carried both spiritual and practical weight. To celebrate a saint's day was to honor the passing of time, to give thanks for survival.
In the evenings, the village gathered in the hall or by the hearth. There were no books, few letters. Knowledge lived in stories, legends of saints, tales of distant wars, fables whispered by travelers. The flickering fire painted faces in gold and shadow. Laughter came easily after a day of toil, though it was tempered by fatigue. Outside, wolves howled in the distance, and the night seemed endless. Inside, the fire was protection, a fragile circle of warmth against the cold and the dark. The Lord's Hall was the center of authority, though it was not immune to hardship. The Lord himself was part farmer, part soldier, part judge. He oversaw disputes, a boundary crossed, a pig stolen, a debt unpaid. His reeve kept records, his steward collected tithes. Beneath the veneer of hierarchy, however, the relationship between lord and peasant was intimate. They depended upon one another. Without his people, the lord had no wealth. Without the lord, the people had no shield against raiders or famine. On holy days, this fragile social order was made visible. The villagers and the Lord's household gathered together for Mass, kneeling on the same earthen floor. In the dim light of the church, class distinctions softened. All were equal before the altar, all bound by the same prayers. When the priest raised his hands to bless the bread, the sound of silence filled the room, a rare peace that transcended hunger, labor, and fear. Faith colored every part of village life. The people saw the hand of God in every change of weather, every birth, every death. A sudden storm was divine anger, a good harvest was a blessing. The bell of the church rang for births, for weddings, for funerals, marking not only time but destiny. The dead were buried in small churchyards surrounded by low stone walls. Their graves were simple, often marked only by wooden crosses that weathered away within a generation. Yet memory endured in stories and in the land itself. To till a field was to walk above one's ancestors. The manor's economy was closed and circular. The peasants, most of them serfs, owed a portion of their labor to the Lord. They plowed his fields before their own, repaired his fences, and helped harvest his grain. In return, they were allowed to farm their small plots and keep part of the yield. It was not freedom, but it was security of a kind. They belonged to the land as much as the land belonged to them. To leave without permission was a crime, yet few wished to wander. The roads beyond the village were still dangerous, and home, however hard, was a place of belonging. Craftsmen gave shape to daily life. The blacksmith was essential. Without him, there were no tools, no nails, no plowshares. The miller ground grain into flour, his water wheel turning ceaselessly with the river's current. The carpenter built carts, doors, and coffers. Each trade carried a hint of magic, a mastery of materials that others could not comprehend. To watch a smith draw glowing iron from the forge was to witness transformation, raw earth turned to usefulness. Over all this, nature remained both ally and adversary. The forest provided wood, game, and berries, but also danger. Boars could kill, wolves stalked livestock, and winters starved the unprepared. Rivers brought life, but also floods. Disease spread easily, and a single bad harvest could empty half the village. The people lived close to the edge, yet they accepted it as the way of the world. Suffering was not a question of fairness, but of endurance. There were moments of joy. Weddings were celebrated with feasting and song. The harvest festival filled the air with the scent of roasted meat and fresh bread. Ale flowed freely, and music from fiddles and pipes echoed through the night. For a brief while, laughter chased away the shadows. The villagers danced barefoot in the dirt, their faces lit by torchlight. Tomorrow they would return to work, but tonight they were alive. The Lord and his family joined in such celebrations, for the boundaries between classes were not impassable. The same crops fed all, the same storms struck all, and the same faith bound them together. When the harvest failed, even the manor stores grew thin. Hunger did not distinguish between peasant and noble. Famine and disease were the great equalizers of the age. In these small communities, the church played more than a spiritual role. It was the record keeper, the healer, the teacher. The priest wrote the births and deaths, mixed herbs for fevers, and sometimes taught a few letters to the Lord's sons. The sound of psalms rising from the chapel gave the village its identity. To be baptized, married, and buried under that same roof was to belong fully to the world. Time in the village flowed differently than it had in Pyre. There were no calendars in every home, no clocks to mark the hours. The days were measured by the sun's arc, the seasons by the color of the fields. Life unfolded slowly, predictably, yet never without tension. Behind every harvest lay the threat of failure, behind every prayer the memory of past loss, yet through repetition came comfort. The plow, the prayer, the fire, each year they returned, and with them a sense of continuity. As centuries passed, the villages multiplied. Each was a small universe, largely self-sufficient but connected to others by trade, marriage, and faith. Together they formed the backbone of medieval Europe, millions of lives turning the same soil, whispering the same prayers, dreaming of a little more light. The Empire of Marble had become an empire of earth, and its strength lay not in armies but in endurance. At dusk, when the fields grew still, smoke curled lazily from the chimneys. The sounds of the day, hammering, plowing, shouting, faded into quiet. Inside, families sat close around the hearth. The fire cracked softly, and shadows danced on the walls. A child fell asleep in a mother's lap. A dog stirred by the door, and the smell of stew lingered in the air. Beyond the shuttered windows, the stars emerged one by one over the dark countryside. Life was hard, but it was theirs. In the stillness of the night, the villagers might have felt, if only for a moment, that peace was possible. The story of the Dark Ages is often told through kings and wars, but its true heart lies here, in the villages that endured. Each thatched roof, each furrow in the soil, each candle flickering before a wooden cross was a declaration that humanity had survived the storm. The people who lived in these small worlds did not know they were rebuilding civilization. They only knew how to work, to pray, and to hope, and from that humble knowledge, a new age slowly began to rise. Part 7: The Keepers of Knowledge. Long after the Empire's roads cracked and its libraries fell silent, a different kind of fortress began to rise, not one of stone and soldiers, but of parchment and prayer. Across the quiet landscapes of early medieval Europe, monasteries stood like islands in a darkened sea. Within their walls, the flame of learning flickered on, sheltered from the wind of chaos that swept the outside world. The men and women who tended that flame would come to be known as the Keepers of Knowledge. A monastery in the 7th or 8th century was more than a place of worship. It was a self-contained world, part refuge, part workshop, part school. Behind its thick walls, time moved differently. The rhythm of bells replaced the rhythm of battle. 7 times a day, the monks gathered to chant the divine office at dawn, mid-morning, noon, afternoon, evening, nightfall, and before sleep. Their voices rose and fell like breathing, a harmony of devotion that gave structure to every hour. When the prayers ended, labor began. The monks tended gardens, pressed olives, and brewed ale. They built barns, tanned hides, and mended roofs. But the most sacred labor took place in the scriptorium, a quiet room filled with light from narrow windows and the faint scent of parchment and ink. Here, learning was preserved one letter at a time. Imagine the scriptorium at dawn. The air is cold, and a single lamp burns, its flame trembling in the draught. Rows of monks sit at wooden desks, each with a sheet of calfskin stretched before him. They write slowly, carefully, their quills scratching like soft rain. The only sounds are the turning of pages, the murmur of Latin prayers, the steady rhythm of thought made visible. Every page is an act of devotion, every line a bridge between the past and the future. The texts they copied were not all holy. Alongside the scriptures and the writings of the church fathers, they preserved works of philosophy, science, and poetry from the ancient world. Aristotle and Virgil, Cicero and Pliny, names that might have vanished were whispered again in these rooms of silence. The monks did not always understand the full meaning of what they copied, but they sensed its importance. In their faith, the act of preservation itself was sacred. To save a word was to save a spark of creation. Each manuscript was a masterpiece of patience. The vellum was scraped smooth with a knife. The ink was made from oak galls and soot mixed with wine. Letters were drawn with precision, each illuminated by hand. Margins bloomed with painted vines, animals, and tiny saints. Gold leaf caught the light, turning the page into a window of radiance. To modern eyes, these illuminations are art. To the monks, they were prayer made visible, light conquering darkness through color and line. Outside the cloister walls, much of Europe still lay in shadow. Villages labored in ignorance of distant lands. Kings ruled by strength more than by thought. Yet in these monasteries, a quiet revolution was unfolding, a reweaving of memory, a rescue of knowledge. The monks became Europe's archivists, librarians, and teachers, their work the silent heartbeat of civilization's recovery. Over time, the monasteries became centers of learning for more than monks. Young nobles sent their sons to study letters and Latin, not for salvation alone, but for governance. The ability to read and write became a form of power, the foundation of administration, trade, and diplomacy. Thus, from these secluded walls, literacy began to flow outward again, like rivers feeding a dry land. In Ireland, the monasteries grew especially vibrant. Cut off from the turmoil of the continent, they became havens of study. Monks sailed between islands carrying books in waterproof satchels, protecting them as if they were relics. They decorated their manuscripts with intricate patterns, knots without beginning or end, symbols of eternity. From these shores, missionaries later carried learning back to Europe, reigniting what had been lost.
In Northumbria, in the north of England, the great monastery of Wearmouth Jarrow housed a library unlike any other. There, a monk named Bede wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people, combining faith and observation in a way that bridged past and present. He measured time, recorded eclipses, and calculated the age of the world with astonishing precision. Bede and others like him proved that curiosity had not died. It had merely gone into retreat, waiting for peace. Elsewhere, Carolingian rulers recognized the power hidden in parchment. Charlemagne, the Frankish king who would become emperor, gathered scholars from across his empire to revive learning. Under his command, monasteries and cathedrals established schools not only for the clergy but for children of common birth. Reading, writing, and counting became tools of order.
The Carolingian Renaissance, small in scale but vast in consequence, was born from the labor of monks who had never seen a battlefield but won a war against forgetting. These new schools multiplied slowly. In each one, a monk stood before a small group of students, teaching them to form letters on wax tablets. The lessons were repetitive and gentle, the alphabet, the Psalms, the beginnings of Latin grammar. Yet every child who learned to read became a thread in a growing tapestry of knowledge. From these humble classrooms would one day emerge universities, libraries, and the rediscovery of science. Monasteries also served as hospitals and archives. Their infirmaries held the era's limited medical wisdom, herbal remedies, poultices, prayers. Their libraries preserved not just words, but measurements of land, lists of crops, and chronicles of seasons. Through their record-keeping, they unknowingly laid the groundwork for history itself. In their chronicles, we find the first careful observations of weather, comets, and harvests. Their curiosity was wrapped in piety, yet it pointed toward reason. Inside the cloister, discipline shaped the mind. Silence was rule and mercy alike. A monk who spoke without cause was punished, but also reminded that silence was the mother of thought. In that silence, reflection deepened. Knowledge was not hurried, it unfolded like dawn through fog. A copied book could take months or years, yet no one complained. To them, eternity was patient. The architecture of monasteries reflected their purpose. The cloister courtyard was an enclosed garden symbolizing paradise regained. Its fountain murmured softly, reminding the monks of the living water of wisdom. Corridors led from the garden to the chapel, the dormitory, and the scriptorium, each a different expression of devotion. The stones themselves seemed to hum with prayer, absorbing centuries of quiet footsteps. Women, too, held part of this legacy. Convents across Europe became sanctuaries for noble women and scholars alike. Figures such as Hilda of Whitby and Hildegard of Bingen would later write, teach, and compose music of extraordinary beauty. Their voices, though rare, carried through the centuries, proof that the guardianship of knowledge was shared by both genders, even in an age that rarely recorded women's names. The manuscripts that survived from this era are fragile, yet they breathe with life. When a monk's hand trembled on the page, it left a trace of his humanity. When ink faded unevenly, it revealed the passing of time. Some pages still bear fingerprints in the margins, moments when a scribe paused to rest his hand or brush away a crumb of dust. Each mark reminds us that civilization's rebirth was not abstract. It was physical, personal, intimate. As the centuries passed, the network of monasteries stretched across the continent like a constellation of light. Their bells marked time not just for their own walls, but for all who lived within hearing. Travelers sought shelter within them. Kings sought counsel. Merchants measured distance from one abbey to the next. 4 monasteries became the safest landmarks on dangerous roads. They were more than religious houses. They were lighthouses guiding the human mind through the fog of the age. By the 11th century, the seed they had planted began to bloom. Schools and cathedral towns grew into centers of scholarship. Students debated logic, theology, and the nature of truth. Slowly, the torch passed from the cloister to the classroom. But without the monks, without their centuries of quiet work, there would have been no flame to pass at all. The keepers of knowledge did not think of themselves as saviors. They did not seek fame or power. They sought only to serve, to copy, to pray, to preserve. Yet their devotion saved the memory of the world. In their hands, the wisdom of Greece and Rome survived the storm. When Europe was ready to awaken, their books were waiting. At night, the monastery slept. The last bell echoed across the valley. In the scriptorium, the lamps were extinguished one by one, leaving only the faint scent of ink and wax. Outside, the stars gleamed above the silent walls, and inside, on wooden shelves, rested hundreds of books, each a heartbeat of history, each a whisper of the light that would one day return. They were the keepers of knowledge, and through their patience, the darkness of the age began very slowly to lift. Part 8. The Viking Shadow. By the 9th century, Europe had begun to stir from its long sleep. The fields were greener, the monasteries busier, and the fragile web of trade was stretching once again between towns and rivers. Bells tolled over valleys, ships carried wool and wine, and the written word had returned to parchment. It was a time of slow recovery, fragile, hopeful, and deeply human. And then, out of the mist and salt of the northern seas, another sound returned. The creak of longships, the beat of oars, the cry of gulls over steel-gray water. The world had forgotten what it was like to fear the horizon. The Vikings reminded it. They came first as raiders. Their ships appeared suddenly, cutting across calm waters like black arrows. Sleek, narrow, and shallow-keeled, the longships could glide up rivers where no warship had ever gone before. Their carved prows, dragons, wolves, and serpents seemed to move with life as the waves lifted them. To the monks and villagers who looked up from their work and saw sails rising like dark wings, the sight felt almost supernatural.
The chroniclers of the time wrote of them with trembling hands. The annals of Saint Bertin recorded, "In this year, The pagans came with their ships from the north, and great terror was upon the people. From Ireland to the Frankish coast, from the Hebrides to the valleys of France, the story was the same. A bell would ring the alarm, people would flee to the forest, and flames would rise where once had been peace. Yet to understand the Vikings only as destroyers is to miss the greater truth. Their arrival was both a storm and a seed. The Northmen were not creatures of chaos, they were products of their own world, one as harsh and beautiful as the lands they left behind. The Viking homelands, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, were places of rock, fjord, and forest. The soil was thin, the winters long, and survival demanded both skill and daring. The sea was their road and their teacher. From an early age, they learned to read the stars and winds, to shape timber into hulls that flexed with the waves, and to live without fear of distance. Their gods rewarded courage, and their culture prized independence. When population grew and resources thinned, young men took to the sea, some to trade, some to explore, some to conquer. Their religion was woven with the elements. They believed in Odin, the All-Father, who sought wisdom through sacrifice, in Thor, who guarded mankind with his hammer, and in Freya, who ruled over love and death. To them, courage was the highest virtue, and to die with honor was the surest path to Valhalla. When such people met the Christian monks of the south who prized humility and peace, the clash was more than physical. It was a collision of worlds. The first recorded Viking raid came in the year 793 upon the monastery of Lindisfarne off the northern coast of England. The monks there had lived in solitude for generations, copying manuscripts and praying for the souls of men they would never meet. One morning, the horizon darkened with sails. The raiders landed swiftly. The church bells rang once, perhaps twice, before being silenced. The raiders took gold, silver, and anything that could be carried, relics, chalices, and captives, then vanished back to sea. To the Christian world, it was an unthinkable act. A holy sanctuary violated, a place of peace drowned in blood. The shock rippled across Europe. The pagans of the north have devastated God's church on Lindisfarne, wrote Alcuin of York, and made a place of joy into a place of mourning. The age of the Viking had begun. The raids spread quickly. Ireland's monasteries, rich in relics and silverwork, became frequent targets. Along the coasts of Francia, ships appeared without warning, striking like lightning and disappearing before any army could gather. They moved up rivers, the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, burning towns deep inland. The Northmen carried with them not only weapons, but fear itself. The old saying, "From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us," became part of the liturgy. Yet even as their axes fell, trade followed in their wake. The same ships that carried warriors also carried merchants. At first they plundered, later they sold. They traded furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves for silver, silk, and wine. Their routes stretched from the cold shores of Scandinavia to the warm markets of Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate. On the rivers of Russia, they built settlements that would one day become cities: Novgorod, Kiev, linking the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Vikings were raiders, yes, but they were also explorers, settlers, and traders. They connected worlds that had forgotten each other. Their influence reshaped the map. In Ireland, they founded Dublin. In Normandy, they settled so deeply that the land took their name, the Northmen's Land. In England, they carved out kingdoms and mingled with the locals, leaving behind words, customs, and bloodlines that still endure. Wherever they went, they left not just destruction, but adaptation.
They forced Europe to harden, to organize, to defend itself, and in doing so, they inadvertently accelerated its rebirth. The monasteries that had once been easy prey began to fortify their walls. Villages built watchtowers along rivers. Kings learned to unite their scattered territories to resist the raids. The Viking threat, paradoxically, helped forge stronger nations. France, England, and parts of Germany all trace the roots of their unity to this shared struggle. Within a few generations, the Vikings themselves began to change. Many settled in the lands they once raided, marrying local women, adopting Christianity, and building towns of their own. The warrior spirit remained, but it was tempered by commerce and faith. Rollo, the Norse leader who received Normandy from the Frankish king Charles the Simple in 911, agreed to convert to Christianity as part of the treaty. His descendants would become some of Europe's most powerful rulers, including William the Conqueror, who would one day carry Norman ambition across the Channel. The transformation from pagan raiders to Christian lords did not happen overnight. In Scandinavia, the old gods lingered long. The sagas written centuries later preserved their stories, tales of Odin's wisdom, of Thor's hammer striking lightning, of the twilight of the gods at Ragnarok.
These myths spoke to a deep understanding of fate and courage, not so distant from the Christian idea of sacrifice and redemption. When the northern peoples finally accepted baptism, they did not abandon their strength, they reshaped it. Their boldness became the boldness of exploration, of curiosity, of reaching beyond the known world.
Indeed, it was the descendants of these seafarers who later sailed to Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, centuries before Columbus. Their longships, carved from oak and driven by human endurance, crossed waters no Roman galley had dared. The same qualities that once inspired terror, mobility, fearlessness, adaptability, became the engines of discovery. For Europe, the Viking Age was a crucible. The invasions brought suffering, yes, but they also reawakened resilience. The cloistered peace of the early medieval world had been shaken, and in that shaking, something vital stirred. The age of isolation ended, the age of interaction began. The Northmen forced Europe to look outward again, to the sea, to trade, to the horizon. Monks who had once hidden their treasures in walls began to write new kinds of chronicles. They recorded the raids, but also the treaties, the conversions, and the strange beauty of the northern visitors. In their words, the Vikings shifted from demons to humans, fierce, flawed, and fascinating. One chronicler from the 9th century observed, almost with admiration, "They are tall as trees, fair of hair, fearless in battle, and tireless at sea." Fear gave way to curiosity, and curiosity to respect. By the late 10th century, the Viking Shadow began to fade. The raids slowed as kingdoms in the north converted and settled. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden became Christian realms, joining the tapestry of medieval Christendom they had once threatened. Their ships still sailed, but now under banners of trade and pilgrimage rather than war. The same hands that once built longships now raised churches of wood and stone along the fjords. And yet their legacy endured. They had reminded Europe that the world was wider than any empire, that the sea was not a boundary, but a road. They carried words and goods and genes across continents, blending cultures that had once been strangers. In their wake, Europe was bloodied but awake, wiser, tougher, and more connected than before. In the quiet that followed their passing, the monasteries rebuilt. Scribes returned to their desks, bells rang once more, and new stories found their way onto parchment, stories of faith tested and restored, of heroes and voyages, of courage that crossed the sea. Out of fear had come knowledge. Out of destruction had come renewal. The Vikings had been a shadow, yes, but a shadow cast by movement, the mark of light trying to rise again. And when, centuries later, the world looked back on those turbulent years, it saw not only the smoke and blood of the raids, but also the reflection of something deeper, the enduring human drive to explore, to adapt, and to endure. The Northmen had not brought darkness to Europe. They had carried it through a darker time and left behind them the first glimmer of dawn. Part 9. Women in the Dark Ages. When people speak of the Dark Ages, they often speak of kings and conquests, of monks and manuscripts, of battles fought and borders drawn. Yet beneath those stories ran another world, quieter, steadier, and far more constant. It was the world of women. While kingdoms rose and fell, women kept the rhythm of life turning. They sewed, healed, taught, prayed, and gave birth to the generations who would inherit the new age. Their names rarely entered the chronicles, but their hands shaped history all the same. In a small village, as dawn breaks, a woman steps from her cottage to draw water from the well. The mist lies thick across the fields, and the air smells of wood smoke and damp earth. She ties her shawl tighter against the chill and begins the day's work, tending the fire, kneading bread, milking the goats, and waking her children. Her life is measured not in years or empires, but in seasons, births, and harvests. She will live and die within sight of the same hills, yet her labor sustains the world beyond her knowing. For most women of the early medieval centuries, life was bound to the land. Peasant women worked alongside men in the fields, sowing and reaping. They gathered herbs, brewed ale, spun wool, and mended tools. Every task had weight. Every hour carried purpose. They were daughters, wives, and mothers, but also producers, healers, and keepers of knowledge passed not through books, but through memory. In their hands, the traditions of cooking, medicine, and midwifery survived when libraries fell to ruin. They were the link between the body of the community and the soul of its endurance. Marriage was both a union and a necessity. In a world without safety nets, families were alliances of survival. A woman's dowry was her contribution to that alliance, a cow, a plot of land, a set of tools. Yet within the home, her role carried more authority than many might imagine.
She managed the household economy, decided how food was stored and distributed, oversaw servants or slaves, and arranged her children's futures. In the narrow boundaries of the medieval village, her influence was quiet but absolute.
Beyond the fields and cottages stood another kind of woman, the noble lady of the manor. Her world was larger, her responsibilities broader, but her life was no less demanding. While her husband rode to war or attended his lord's court, she governed the estate.
She settled disputes among tenants, ensured the harvest was gathered, and provided hospitality to travelers and pilgrims. She kept the household's accounts, its stores, its loyalty to the church. The lady of the manor was both administrator and matriarch, her authority sealed not by crown or sword but by the trust of those who depended on her.
Education for women varied by class and fortune. Noble daughters might learn to read the Psalms, to write a careful Latin hand, or to embroider scenes from Scripture. Some were taught to play the harp or to recite poetry. Others, especially those destined for convents, received a more rigorous education. In the quiet of monasteries for women, literacy survived and even flourished. The convent became one of the few places in the medieval world where a woman might live by her own rule, study, and create. In these sacred spaces, women found a voice that society often denied them. The abbess ruled her community with authority equal to any male abbot. She managed lands, oversaw scribes, and corresponded with bishops and kings. In Ireland and Anglo-Saxon England, some double monasteries housing both men and women were governed entirely by abbesses. The church saw them as spiritual mothers guiding souls rather than families. Their influence reached far beyond cloister walls.
Among these, certain names have survived the centuries like faintly glowing embers. Hilda of Whitby, who presided over a great synod in the 7th century, advised rulers and trained scholars. Hildegard of Bingen, centuries later, composed music of astonishing complexity, wrote treatises on nature and medicine, and corresponded with popes and emperors.
Her visions filled pages with luminous imagery that blended theology and science. In her voice, the Middle Ages found one of its earliest female intellects, a mind that refused to remain unseen.
Other women shaped the political world directly. Queens and regents held power in their husband's absence or their children's minority. The Frankish Queen Brunhild ruled vast territories, led armies, and issued laws. The Byzantine Empress Theodora, rising from humble beginnings, became co-ruler beside Justinian, defending women's rights and the poor.
In England, Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, commanded fortresses and armies against the Danes, her name spoken with respect even by those who feared her. Their strength challenged the age's assumptions, reminders that leadership could wear many faces. But most women's influence was exercised in smaller, subtler ways. The weaver's pattern, the healer's herb, the mother's lullaby, these were forms of continuity that outlasted kings. In every village, women knew the secrets of plants, which leaves could ease fever, which roots could stop bleeding, which flowers might bring sleep.
Their remedies blended Christian prayer with older, pagan wisdom, and though priests sometimes condemned such practices as superstition, they relied on them all the same. The line between saint and healer, miracle and medicine, was thin.
The Church's view of women was conflicted. Scripture and tradition placed them both beneath men and at the heart of salvation. Here, Eve had brought sin, but Mary had brought redemption. The Virgin became the model of purity, motherhood, and compassion, an image both idealized and impossible.
Women were encouraged to emulate her humility, yet they also drew strength from her quiet power. In Mary, they saw not submission but endurance, the strength to bear sorrow without surrender. Faith offered women a refuge from worldly limits. For some, the convent was a sanctuary, for others, a calling. The nun's veil granted a form of autonomy unknown to most of her sisters outside. Within the convent's walls, women taught, wrote, and healed. They copied manuscripts, cultivated herbs, and illuminated texts with careful hands.
Their prayers rose through the centuries, joining the chants of their brothers in neighboring monasteries. In their silence, they became authors of an unseen revolution, the preservation of learning, compassion, and order through devotion. The Viking Age, too, brought a unique dynamic for women in the north. Norse culture, while warlike, granted its women certain freedoms uncommon elsewhere. They could inherit property, manage estates, and demand divorce. Saga literature remembers women as strong and articulate, shaping the fates of men through counsel or curse. When Norse settlers integrated into Christian Europe, some of that independence lingered, an echo of a time when courage was valued regardless of gender. Across Europe, women's labor sustained every layer of society. In towns, widows often ran workshops or inns. Midwives and healers served as the only medical aid many would ever know. Pilgrims' hostels and hospitals founded by religious sisters offered care to travelers and the sick. In times of war, women defended their homes, negotiated ransoms, and rebuilt what battles destroyed. Their resilience was the key constant of the age. Though most women remained illiterate, they were keepers of oral memory. Songs, prayers, and stories passed from mother to child carried fragments of history no chronicler recorded, tales of famine, love, loss, and endurance. When the official histories spoke only of kings, these unwritten voices preserved the human heart of the age. Yet not all stories were gentle. The Dark Ages could be cruel to women. Law codes reflected both protection and oppression. A woman's worth was measured in silver, her war guild if she were wronged or killed. Inheritance favored men, power was often seized by force. Many women lived under the constant shadow of childbirth, which claimed countless lives. To survive was itself a victory. Still, they persisted, adapting, enduring, finding strength in community and faith. Over centuries, their collective presence reshaped culture in ways unseen but profound. The cult of the Virgin softened the warrior ethos of early medieval Europe, infusing it with compassion and reverence for motherhood. Women's voices in monasteries enriched theology with gentleness and curiosity. Their work in healing and teaching preserved the thread of empathy that would later flourish in hospitals and universities. Without their quiet continuity, the spiritual and emotional life of the West might have hardened into something far colder. Imagine again that village at dusk. The day's labor is done, and smoke drifts from the hearths. A woman sits beside the fire, spinning wool into thread. Her daughter hums softly nearby. Outside, the church bell marks the evening prayer. In the manor above, another woman, the lady of the estate, writes a letter to her husband campaigning far away, sealing it with wax and hope. In a distant convent, a nun bends over a manuscript, illuminating the face of the Virgin in gold. They will never meet, yet their lives are bound by the same rhythm: patience, duty, endurance. In their own ways, these women built the bridge from darkness to dawn. Their wisdom kept families alive through famine, their faith kept compassion alive through violence, their intellect kept memory alive through silence. They were farmers and queens, saints and healers, widows and writers, the unseen architects of stability in an age of turmoil. When historians later look back and called these centuries dark, they perhaps forgot the steady light that burned in every home, every convent, every cradle. It was women who tended that light, feeding it with care, protecting it with love, passing it on so it would never die. The Dark Ages were never truly dark where a woman's lamp still burned. Part 10: The Lords of War. The Middle Ages were born in conflict. When the old order fell and new kingdoms rose from its ruins, peace became a luxury few could afford. Every valley, every hilltop, every river bend carried the memory of struggle. The tools of war, the sword, the shield, the fortress, were as familiar to the people of this age as the plow and the cross. Violence was not only destruction, it was the grim architecture on which society rebuilt itself. From this crucible emerged a new kind of ruler, the Lord of War. He was not a distant emperor commanding legions, but a local power whose authority rested on land, loyalty, and the strength of arms. His domain might stretch only a few miles, but within that circle his word was law. Around him grew the system that defined the medieval world: feudalism, a web of oaths binding soldier to master, master to king, and king to the unseen will of God. To understand this world, one must begin with the land. The feudal contract was born from it and fed by it. A king granted his nobles estates, fiefs, in exchange for service. Each noble, in turn, offered parts of his land to knights and vassals who swore to fight in his name. Below them, Peasants tilled the soil, their labor sustaining the warriors who were meant to protect them. It was a chain of need and obligation, simple in theory, endlessly complex in life. At its heart lay one truth: the sword had replaced the law. Where once Roman officials had governed through edict and decree, now justice rode on horseback. Across the landscape, stone began to rise. At first, these were simple fortifications, earth mounds topped with wooden towers, called motte and bailey. From these small beginnings, the great castles of Europe would grow. Built on high ground or beside rivers, their thick walls and narrow windows spoke of both fear and pride. They were the lords' thrones and their shields. From these strongholds they could defend their lands, collect their dues, and watch the horizon for smoke, the sure sign of war. Imagine the sight of such a fortress in the 10th century. The sun sets behind it, painting the towers in amber light. A drawbridge crosses a moat filled with still, dark water. Within the walls, torches flicker, and the sound of the blacksmith's hammer rings against stone. Horses stamp in the stables. Servants hurry through the courtyards. The air smells of iron, leather, and smoke. The castle was not only a symbol of power, it was a living organism, a small city built for survival. For the peasant looking up from the fields, the castle was both protector and burden. Its lord promised defense against raiders, but his protection came at a cost. The villagers owed labor, crops, and obedience. In return, the lord was bound to defend them, a duty he might or might not fulfill. When rival nobles clashed, it was often the peasants who suffered most, their homes burned, their fields trampled, their lives consumed by conflicts they neither chose nor understood. War was not distant. It passed through their doors. Battles in this age were rarely vast affairs of nations. They were personal, local, and brutal. Disputes over borders, inheritance, or insults often ended in arms. A quarrel between two lords could drag entire villages into chaos. Armies were small, dozens or hundreds of men, but their impact was devastating. A single raid could undo a season's labor. Cattle were stolen, granaries emptied, and the survivors left to start again. The cycle of attack and rebuilding became the rhythm of life. For the men who fought, war was both duty and identity. The knight was its living symbol. He trained from childhood, first as a page, then as a squire, learning to ride, to wield the sword, to obey, and to command. By the age of 21, he was dubbed a knight, kneeling before his lord as a sword tapped his shoulder. The ceremony was half military, half religious. The church had baptized war, transforming the warrior into a defender of faith and order. The ideal of chivalry, from cheval the horse, grew from this union of violence and virtue. In practice, chivalry was a dream more often spoken than lived. Knights swore to protect the weak and uphold justice, but in times of famine or feud, those vows were forgotten. Yet the idea mattered. It softened the edges of brutality, offered a moral mirror to a world of steel. In songs and poems, the knight became a figure of courage and honor. Troubadours sang of loyalty and love. Chroniclers praised valor and mercy. These stories gave meaning to the endless fighting and, in time, inspired something like restraint. The church sought to tame the sword's hunger. Through edicts like the Peace of God and the Truce of God, it forbade violence against peasants, clergy, and pilgrims, and urged warriors to lay down arms during holy seasons. These were rarely obeyed in full, but they planted the seed of a revolutionary idea that even war could be bound by conscience. The ideal would echo for centuries, shaping codes of conduct and the concept of just war. Meanwhile, the technology of warfare evolved. The wooden fortresses of early feudalism gave way to stone keeps with curtain walls and gatehouses. The bow grew stronger, the spear longer, the armor heavier. Iron helmets gleamed beneath banners stitched with family crests. Siege engines appeared, catapults, battering rams, and towers on wheels. Each innovation bred another. The contest between defense and attack drove medieval ingenuity as surely as faith drove prayer. Yet even amid this machinery of destruction, life persisted. Within castle walls, there were gardens, chapels, and kitchens. Children played in courtyards where soldiers drilled. Women managed households, tended the wounded, and prayed for absent husbands. Minstrels performed songs to soften long winters. Priests offered mass before campaigns, sprinkling holy water on swords that would soon spill blood. The contradiction was constant, sanctity and slaughter intertwined. For the common people, war was both terror and routine. They built ditches and wooden palisades around villages, took shelter in churches when armies passed, and fled to forests when danger came too near. Sometimes they joined the fighting, not as knights, but as foot soldiers armed with whatever they could find, scythes, axes, or sharpened stakes. In the chaos, heroism and tragedy often looked the same. Over generations, the ceaseless fighting produced something unexpected: structure. Out of chaos, hierarchy hardened. Titles like Count, Duke, and Baron formalized power. Armor and horses became marks of class. Land, rather than lineage, defined nobility, and the ability to defend it defined legitimacy. Europe became a patchwork of fortified lordships, each both kingdom and prison to those who lived within. Despite the suffering it caused, war also carried strange fruits. It spurred the growth of towns around castles, where craftsmen and traders gathered to serve garrisons. It encouraged cooperation between rulers and the church, forging alliances that strengthened both. It fostered diplomacy, as even the most stubborn lord learned that peace could be more profitable than plunder. Conflict, in its grim way, became a teacher, and yet there were moments when the cruelty was too great to ignore. Whole regions were laid waste, and famine followed the sword. Chroniclers wrote of villages turned to ash, of mothers searching for children taken as captives, of fields littered with the unburied dead. These accounts remind us that behind the shining image of the night lay a darker truth, one of human fragility and endless cost. The lords of war were protectors and predators alike. Still, the world moved forward. By the 12th century, the age of small wars began to give way to something larger, the wars of faith that would carry knights across continents. The Crusades would soon turn their blades toward the Holy Land, carrying both zeal and destruction. But before that chapter began, Europe itself had been reshaped by its own storms. In every castle, in every field scarred by battle, the traces of this transformation remained. Stone replaced wood, authority replaced chaos, and oaths replaced chance. The sword, for all its blood, had carved stability. The men who wielded it became symbols not only of power but of order. Their castles, once shelters from fear, would become the centers of culture, administration, and art. Out of the clangor of war rose the architecture of civilization itself. At night, when the fighting ceased, silence returned to the land. The stars shone above the broken fields, and the cries of men gave way to the crackle of campfires. Somewhere, a wounded knight whispered a prayer. In distant villages, families crept from hiding to see what remained. And always, after the storm, came rebuilding. The rhythm of medieval life was a rhythm of ruin and repair, loss and endurance. The lords of war believed themselves masters of fate, yet history would see them as instruments of transition, the rough hands that shaped Europe's edges. They left behind fortresses and bloodlines, legends and lamentations. Their legacy was not peace, but the possibility of peace forged from the discipline of conflict. And so, in the twilight of this violent century, the fires of war began to dim. The castles still stood, their walls casting long shadows over the fields. Within them, life continued. Prayers whispered, children born, fields plowed, bells rung. The sword had given Europe its scars, but also its spine. Out of war, order had come. Out of ruin, a strange kind of balance. And from the iron will of those who fought and those who survived them, a new dawn waited beyond the horizon. Part 11, The Voice of the Church. By the 11th century, the church was no longer a fragile refuge in a broken world. It had become the heartbeat of Europe, a voice that spoke not only to the spirit, but to every corner of life. From the smallest village chapel to the soaring cathedrals rising above stone cities, faith wove through the fabric of existence. Its power reached kings and peasants alike. It offered hope, demanded obedience, and defined what it meant to be human in an age both devout and uncertain. Its bells marked the hours, its feasts measured the year, its prayers shaped the rhythm of each day. The world moved according to its calendar: Advent, Lent, Easter, and the long green stretches of ordinary time between. The saints filled the days with meaning. Every action, from planting crops to sealing treaties, began with a blessing. The church's voice was in every whisper of daily life, reminding all that time itself belonged to God. Yet that voice was not one, but many. It rang from pulpits, sang from choirs, whispered in confessionals, and thundered from thrones. It was the voice of the priest and the monk, the hermit, and the pope, each speaking a different language of faith, yet all echoing the same authority. It was both comfort and command, mercy and discipline, promise and warning. To understand this voice, one must see the two faces of the medieval church. One looked upward toward heaven, prayer, and salvation. The other looked outward toward kings, laws, and the order of the world. Between the two stood the altar, where politics and eternity met in the flicker of a candle. The Church of the Middle Ages was built on hierarchy, mirroring the feudal world that surrounded it. At its summit stood the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, heir to St. Peter, believed to hold the keys to heaven itself. His word could crown kings or cast them down, bless empires or curse them with excommunication. Below him spread a vast network of bishops and abbots, priests and monks, each governing souls within their care. The chain of authority ran from the highest palace to the humblest chapel, binding Europe in a single spiritual web. But this hierarchy was not merely power for its own sake. It was also protection. In a world still scarred by famine, plague, and war, the Church offered stability, rules that guided the uncertain, rituals that anchored time, and the promise that suffering was not meaningless. For a peasant who had never left his valley, the Church's voice was the only constant from cradle to grave. At birth, the priest poured holy water upon the infant's head, marking the soul as God's own. At marriage, he blessed the joining of hands and the promise of family. At death, he whispered final prayers and sprinkled the coffin with the same water that had begun the journey. Life was a pilgrimage from one sacrament to another, each step bound by the Church's care. In this way, faith was both personal and communal. Each believer carried a private devotion to a saint, a relic, a place of pilgrimage, yet all shared the same rituals, the same chants, the same sense of belonging to something vast and eternal. The church was not only an institution, it was the invisible thread connecting a shepherd in the Alps to a king in Paris, a nun in Burgundy to a fisherman in England. Its unity was not merely imposed, it was believed. As centuries passed, the church's spiritual power became inseparable from its temporal might. It owned land, collected tithes, and governed towns. Its bishops sat beside princes in council chambers. Its abbots ruled over estates larger than some kingdoms. The church's wealth flowed from faith, but it also created tension between those who sought heaven and those tempted by gold. Yet even at its most worldly, the church clothed its authority in the language of the sacred. Kings were crowned not by their peers, but by the church's servants, their foreheads anointed with holy oil, as if they were chosen by God Himself. Such power made the church both indispensable and feared. Still, its voice was not always commanding. In monasteries and cloisters, another tone could be heard, gentler, humbler, filled with longing rather than decree. They believed that learning itself was a form of prayer, and that to illuminate a manuscript or compose a hymn was to bring beauty into God's creation. Their silence was its own kind of sermon, a reminder that truth could be found in stillness. In the cities, cathedrals began to rise, stone mountains of faith that seemed to touch the heavens. Builders worked for generations, their hands guided by architects who saw geometry as divine order made visible. Stained glass turned sunlight into theology, telling stories of saints and salvation in color and light. The people who gazed upon them might not read Latin, but they read these walls. They saw in their glow the hope of eternity. The church's voice spoke here not through words, but through awe. For ordinary people, the church was less a hierarchy than a neighbor. The village priest was confidant, healer, teacher, and judge. He baptized their children, heard their sins, and blessed their crops. His sermons were short and simple, often stories rather than doctrine, parables of mercy, warnings of pride, reminders that heaven watched even the humblest hut. His authority came not from Rome, but from presence. When he stood before his flock, he carried the weight of both comfort and command. Faith colored every corner of life. Before sowing the fields, farmers asked God's favor. Travelers sought blessings for safe passage. Women in labor prayed to Saint Margaret. Sailors called upon Saint Nicholas. The saints were countless, each the patron of a trade, a place, or a peril. In their stories, people found reflections of their own lives, suffering made meaningful, courage rewarded, loss redeemed. Through them, heaven felt closer, almost human. Across Europe, roads led to holy places, Santiago, Canterbury, Rome, and countless smaller shrines. Pilgrims walked for weeks or months, carrying little more than bread, a staff, and their prayers. Along the way, they found companionship in strangers and solace in repetition, step after step, day after day, toward grace. To walk was to believe, to move through suffering toward redemption. Even those who never left home shared in this journey through imagination and prayer. For many, the church was not only hope in this life, but the key to the next. Heaven and hell were not abstractions. They were as real as hunger or rain. Paintings and carvings in churches showed souls weighed by angels and demons, reminding the faithful that eternity hung in balance. Fear and faith walked hand in hand. To sin was to risk the fires of damnation, to confess was to return to light. The church's voice guided both paths, stern yet forgiving, demanding yet merciful. As its power grew, the church also faced its own shadows. Ambition, corruption, and conflict sometimes drowned its higher call. Bishops fought over wealth, popes quarreled with kings. The voice that was meant to unify often divided. The Great Schism of 1054 split Christendom between East and West, Rome and Constantinople, two halves of one faith that would never again be whole. Later, rival popes would even excommunicate each other, confusing the very souls they sought to shepherd. And yet, even amid such turmoil, faith endured. The people did not lose their devotion. They simply looked for it where it still burned bright, in the monasteries, in the songs of pilgrims, in the silence of prayer. The church was vast enough to contain both pride and humility, corruption and sanctity. It was, in many ways, as human as the world it sought to save. From this complex institution, the idea of Christendom emerged, a single spiritual community stretching from the Atlantic to the Baltic, united by belief, if not by peace. In its name, kings raised armies, scholars debated truth, and peasants offered their labor to build cathedrals that would outlast them all. The church's voice echoed through every layer of society, the voice of prayer, of law, of order, of longing. To step into a medieval church was to step into another world. The scent of incense hung in the air, mingling with candle smoke. The floor was cold stone, worn smooth by generations of feet. The light that passed through stained glass shimmered like liquid color across the walls. The priest's Latin words rose and fell like song, their meaning mysterious yet deeply felt. For the illiterate masses, the liturgy was not understood but experienced. Faith not as knowledge, but as presence. This experience was deliberate. The church spoke to the senses, sight, sound, touch, as much as to the mind. The ringing of bells, the gleam of gold, the rhythm of chant, all drew the believer into communion with something greater. The church's voice was everywhere, but often it spoke without words. It was in the rustle of robes, the taste of bread and wine, the silence after prayer. It spoke not to reason, but to wonder. For those who sought deeper meaning, there were schools growing within the church's walls. Monks and scholars began to ask questions that had slept for centuries about nature, truth, and the mind of God. Their work would sow the seeds of universities and philosophy. Even their debates were acts of devotion, for they believed that to understand creation was to praise the Creator. Faith and thought walked hand in hand, though not always in harmony. The church's voice had begun as a whisper among ruins, but now it thundered across continents. It sanctified kings, bound nations, and filled the air with the sound of bells. Yet beneath its grandeur, the essence of faith remained simple, the need to believe that life, with all its pain and uncertainty, had purpose. For the noble, that faith gave legitimacy. For the monk, it gave meaning. For the peasant, it gave endurance. The church's voice spoke differently to each, but always with the same promise that beyond toil and fear lay redemption, and beyond death, light. At dusk, in a small village chapel, a priest raises a candle before the altar. Outside, the fields are dark, the air cool and still. The people kneel on the earthen floor, their faces lined with age and work. The priest begins to chant, his voice rising softly in the ancient words. The same prayer echoes that night in cathedrals and monasteries across the land, one vast chorus beneath the stars. For a moment, the entire world seems to breathe together. Kings and beggars, monks and soldiers, saints and sinners, all joined in one fragile harmony of faith. This was the power of the church, not only to rule, but to unite. Its voice could command armies, yet also soothe the dying. It could crown emperors, yet also bless a child's cradle. It was a voice both human and eternal, a bridge between heaven and earth, between fear and hope. and the darkness of the age, that voice was never silent. It was the heartbeat of a civilization still finding its way, steady, flawed, and full of grace. Part 12, Plague and Prayer. The Middle Ages had long been an age of endurance, of hunger, of war, of faith that refused to die. Yet nothing tested that endurance like the coming of the plague. It arrived without warning, invisible as the wind, and changed the course of the world. To those who lived through it, it felt as though God himself had turned his face away. And yet, even in that darkness, the prayers did not cease. Faith bent beneath the weight of fear, but it did not break. Long before the great pestilence of the 14th century, the one history remembers as the Black Death, sickness was already a familiar presence. Disease haunted every century of the Middle Ages. Fevers came with summer, famine with winter, and death with the turning of each season. Villages buried their young as often as their old. The body was fragile, medicine uncertain, and life precarious. Yet people found comfort in the rhythm of prayer, believing that suffering was not meaningless but a passage through which the soul might be purified. The great plagues, however, were something else. They came like storms, unrelenting and inexplicable. The first had struck long ago, in the 6th century, the plague of Justinian, sweeping through Constantinople and across the Mediterranean world, killing millions. For centuries afterward, stories of that time were retold like nightmares that refused to fade. And then in the 1340s, the nightmare returned. No one understood its cause. Some said it was punishment for sin. Others whispered of poisoned wells or foul winds or the alignment of planets. Scholars studied the stars, doctors burned herbs, and priests carried relics through the streets. Yet the death spread faster than words could explain. It began, they said, in the lands of the East, in the caravan routes of Asia along the harbors of the Black Sea, and then followed the ships that carried grain and trade to the cities of Europe. Rats and fleas bore it unseen, but to those who watched it seemed to move like a curse. When it reached the ports of Italy, it moved inland with terrifying speed. In towns and villages alike, the first signs were always the same: fever, swelling, pain, and the sudden collapse of strength. People died within days, sometimes hours. Whole families vanished, streets emptied, fields were left untended, and the sound of day and night. Chroniclers wrote that corpses lay piled in churches, and gravediggers themselves fell before their work was done. The church struggled to make sense of what it saw. Some priests fled in terror, others stayed, offering last rites until they too succumbed. Monks carried the dead to shallow graves, chanting psalms as they went. The air was thick with incense, but it could not mask the smell of decay. In cities, processions of penitents marched barefoot through the streets, whipping their backs in desperate pleas for mercy. They prayed that their suffering might atone for the world's sin. For a moment, it seemed that all of Europe was on its knees, begging heaven for forgiveness. And yet, amid this despair, the church's voice wavered. Faith that had once explained everything began to tremble under the weight of so much death. If God was merciful, how could this be his will? If prayer was protection, why were the devout dying beside the faithless? Such questions whispered in the hearts of even the most steadfast believers. The plague was not merely a disease, it was a crisis of meaning. Still, faith adapted. In the ruins of certainty, people turned to new forms of devotion. Saints of healing, St. Roch, St. Sebastian, and the Virgin Mary herself became the focus of fervent prayer. Pilgrims sought shrines said to offer miracles. Families built small altars in their homes where candles burned through sleepless nights. Hope moved inward, quieter but more resilient. The church, shaken but not broken, began to speak not of punishment but of compassion, urging the living to care for one another, to tend the sick, to pray for the dead. Medicine, too, changed. Physicians studied symptoms, recorded patterns, and sought causes beyond divine wrath. Though they lacked the tools of modern science, their careful observation laid early foundations for rational inquiry. Some monasteries kept records of outbreaks, noting their timing, their movement, their effects. Knowledge became a form of resistance, an attempt to bring order to what seemed chaos.
Slowly, the idea grew that disease might have natural causes, and that understanding those causes was not defiance of God, but service to His creation.
The plague reshaped society as deeply as it scarred the soul. With so many dead, labor became precious. Peasants found themselves in sudden demand, their work valued as never before. Wages rose, old feudal bonds weakened. Villages that had once been bound by obligation began to taste freedom. In this way, the devastation carried the seeds of transformation. The world that emerged afterward was smaller in number but larger in possibility. In the towns, survivors rebuilt. Churches were rededicated, fields replanted, and markets reopened. The bells that had once tolled for death now rang for life again. But the memory of what had happened lingered in art, in stone, in silence. Murals of the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death, appeared on church walls, showing skeletons leading men and women of every rank in a grim procession. Kings and beggars, bishops and peasants, all equal before the grave. It was not mockery, but acceptance, a reminder that mortality united them all. The church itself changed in response. In the years after the Black Death, new movements of spirituality rose, some emphasizing humility and simplicity, others calling for reform. The mystics of the 14th century, women and men alike, spoke of a personal connection to the divine, unmediated by hierarchy.
Figures such as Catherine of Siena and Meister Eckhart preached that God could be found within the heart as much as in the cathedral. Out of suffering grew introspection, and out of loss, compassion. Even the architecture of faith reflected this shift. The great cathedrals continued to rise, but so too did smaller chapels dedicated to healing saints and to the memory of the dead. Cemeteries expanded into consecrated fields called God's Acres, where families visited graves with flowers and prayer. The separation between life and death softened.
Heaven felt closer, not distant, for death had become a familiar companion. For those who survived, gratitude became a way of life. A harvest gathered, a child born, a sickness overcome. These were miracles enough. The church encouraged this renewed appreciation, teaching that endurance itself was a form of faith. Suffering could not always be explained, but it could be sanctified. To endure was to imitate Christ, who bore pain for the sake of salvation. Thus, even in grief, people found dignity. Not all responses were holy. Fear bred suspicion, and suspicion bred cruelty. In some towns, minorities, particularly Jews, were accused of causing the plague through witchcraft or poison. Many were killed, their communities destroyed by terror and ignorance. The church, in its confusion, sometimes failed to defend them, though a few brave voices cried out against the violence. These moments remind us that even in an age of prayer, humanity could still stumble into darkness. But the story of plague is not only a story of death, it is also a story of resilience. The survivors carried forward more than scars. They carried a new awareness of life's fragility and of its worth. Art, music, and devotion in the centuries that followed reflected this sharpened sensitivity. The church, humbled and renewed, spoke more often of mercy than of wrath. It built hospitals and almshouses, cared for orphans, and began to see compassion as its greatest strength. The echo of those years never truly faded. Each new outbreak reminded Europe of what had been endured, but also of what had been learned. When later generations faced smaller epidemics, they met them not only with prayer, but with preparation. Bells still rang, but alongside them came physicians' notes, quarantine laws, and civic care. Faith and reason began to walk together, however uneasily. For the common people, plague and prayer became inseparable. To light a candle in a church was not simply ritual, it was defiance of despair. To bury the dead with dignity was an act of hope. In the quiet that followed each wave of sickness, the survivors would gather at Mass, their voices trembling as they sang familiar hymns. They had seen the world end and begin again. Every prayer was a way of saying, "We are still here." The great pestilences reshaped the Middle Ages in ways no king or war ever could. They thinned the population but thickened the bonds of community. They silenced voices but deepened thought. They broke old systems yet gave birth to new ones. And through it all, the Church remained not unscathed but transformed. It had faced its greatest trial and discovered that power alone could not save the soul of man. Only compassion could. When night fell on a village after the plague had passed, the silence was deep. The air smelled of rain and turned earth, of candles burning low on home altars. Families knelt together, whispering prayers for those they had lost. Above them, the same stars shone that had watched empires rise and fall. And in that fragile stillness, something sacred lingered, not triumph, but peace. The plagues had come and gone, as all storms do. What remained was the human spirit, bruised, humbled, but live, and the faith that refused to die, even in the darkest hour. Prayer had not ended the suffering, but it had carried the living through it. And so the bells rang once more, their sound traveling over the quiet fields. Each note was a memory, a warning, and a promise. The people of Europe had walked through the valley of death and found, on the other side, the faint but steady light of dawn. Part 13. The Dawn of Change. The long night of the Dark Ages had been filled with storms of war, plague, famine, and faith. Yet even the longest winter ends. By the 12th century, a quiet transformation was underway across Europe. It did not arrive suddenly, nor with fanfare. It came like spring creeping across a frozen field, a green shoot here, a bell ringing there, the slow awakening of hope after generations of endurance. The world that emerged from the ruins of the early Middle Ages was not the same world that had fallen with Rome. It was smaller, humbler, wiser. People remembered hunger, remembered loss, remembered the silence of the plague years. And perhaps because of that memory, they began to build with greater care. They did not aim for grandeur at first, but for steadiness. Out of patience came progress. Villages that had once huddled behind wooden palisades began to grow into towns. Traders set up markets along crossroads and rivers. The sound of hammers replaced the sound of swords. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and weavers found new work as roads reopened and caravans once again carried goods across the continent. In the empty ruins of Roman cities, life returned. Streets filled with the noise of carts and chatter, Bells rang for commerce as much as for prayer, and children chased one another through alleys where moss had once grown undisturbed. The land itself seemed to breathe again. Fields long abandoned were cleared anew. Windmills turned above the plains of Flanders, grinding grain more efficiently than ever before. Heavy plows drawn by teams of oxen cut deeper into the soil, producing larger harvests. With better food came stronger bodies, and with stronger bodies came larger families. For the first time in centuries, Europe began to grow. Trade stitched together what isolation had once torn apart. Merchants from the Italian city-states carried spices, silks, and stories from the east. In return, the north sent wool, timber, and iron. Rivers that had once been barriers became highways. Towns rose along their banks, protected by walls, but open to opportunity. Markets turned into fairs, fairs into permanent centers of trade. Coins passed more frequently from hand to hand, and with each exchange came the faint glimmer of prosperity. The church, too, felt this renewal. Cathedrals rose higher and brighter, their pointed arches and stained glass catching the morning light like prisms of faith. Builders spoke of opus franciganum, the French work, a style that would come to be called Gothic. Its very structure seemed to defy the weight of stone, lifting the eyes toward heaven and filling the air with color. These cathedrals were more than churches. They were statements of hope, proof that humanity, even after centuries of darkness, could still reach upward. Yet beneath this renewal ran humility. The people who built the New World had not forgotten how fragile life could be. Every bell that rang for a wedding also rang for the dead. Every market square still carried the memory of plague pits beneath its stones. In this way, joy and sorrow walked together, the one giving meaning to the other. The dawn of change did not erase the past, it transformed it. Learning, too, began to stir from its long sleep.
The monasteries that had preserved ancient texts became seeds for something new, schools devoted not only to prayer but to study. In cathedral towns like Chartres, Bologna, and Paris, scholars gathered to teach and debate. They read Aristotle and Augustine, scripture and science, seeking harmony between reason and faith. Their questions echoed through the vaulted halls: what is truth?
How does the world work? Can the mind made by God understand the mind of God? These were not challenges to belief, but acts of devotion, attempts to see the divine more clearly through understanding. From these schools, universities would grow. Young men and a few extraordinary women came from across Europe to study. They learned Latin, law, medicine, and philosophy. They copied manuscripts, argued, and dreamed. Knowledge, once hidden behind monastery walls, began to flow outward. The old fear of curiosity slowly softened into admiration for inquiry. To study creation was to praise the Creator. Beyond the schools, new voices began to rise: poets, chroniclers, and travelers. The troubadours of southern France sang of love and honor, blending the language of devotion with the language of the heart. Chronicles recorded the deeds of kings and the building of cathedrals. Stories, once told by the fireside, found their way onto parchment. The spoken became written, memory became history. The great roads were alive again. Pilgrims walked them not in fear, but in faith renewed. Merchants carried goods and gossip from one kingdom to another. Soldiers rode under banners not only of conquest but of defense, guarding trade routes and borders that had once been wild. The idea of Europe, not as a collection of tribes but as a shared civilization, began faintly to take shape. Still, the transformation was uneven. not all felt the dawn at once. In some regions, poverty remained deep and famine could still strike with little warning. Lords and peasants continued their delicate dance of dependence. The church, powerful and wealthy, sometimes forgot its own teachings, but alongside corruption grew conscience. Reformers called for purity and compassion. New monastic orders, the Cistercians, the Franciscans, sought simplicity and service, bringing faith back to the fields and streets. Their message was gentle but revolutionary. Holiness was not only found in stone walls, but in kindness and humility. In this new light, the image of man began to change. The medieval world had long seen humanity as fallen, bound by sin and awaiting grace. Now, a different note entered the song, the belief that man, though flawed, could also create beauty, order, and meaning. This faith in human potential was not arrogance but gratitude, a recognition that life, so fragile and fleeting, was still worthy of care. As towns prospered, new guilds formed, associations of craftsmen who protected their trades and passed on their knowledge. The mason, the baker, the carpenter, the tailor, each took pride in his craft. Their guild halls became places of fellowship and learning, and their patron saints symbols of dignity in labor. The world was no longer divided only between those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked. A new class was emerging, those who built. In art, the same transformation unfolded. Painters and sculptors turned their attention not only to heaven, but to the world around them. Saints were still carved in stone, but now their faces showed gentleness, their gestures warmth. Nature, once a backdrop for divine drama, became a subject in itself. Trees, rivers, and light celebrated as part of creation's wonder. In this subtle shift, one can see the first glimmer of what would one day become the Renaissance. But in these centuries of renewal, there was no single moment of triumph, no clear dividing line between dark and light. The dawn was gradual, filled with twilight and memory. Each step forward carried a trace of the past. The farmers still prayed for rain, the priests still feared heresy, the builders still carved their cathedrals one stone at a time. Yet through it all there was movement, slow, steady, and full of quiet determination. Imagine standing on a hill overlooking one of these reborn towns at sunset. Below, the rooftops glow red with fading light. Smoke drifts gently from chimneys, mingling with the scent of bread from the market square. The bell of the cathedral tolls deep and resonant, its sound carrying over the river. Children laugh somewhere in the distance, their voices echoing between walls newly built. The horizon, once a place of fear, now holds promise. The people of this age would not have recognized their own transformation. To them, life was simply life, hard, precious, uncertain. But to those who look back, it is clear the long winter was ending. The seeds sown in faith, patience, and endurance were beginning to flower. Out of ruin, a new world was rising, not perfect, not peaceful, but alive. The dawn of change was not a single moment of light, but the slow kindling of many small fires in homes, in hearts, in monasteries and workshops, in schools and cathedrals. Each spark carried forward what centuries of darkness had tried to extinguish, the belief that life could be better, kinder, and more full of meaning. The people who lived through it did not call it a rebirth. They simply worked, prayed, built, and dreamed. But their quiet labor became the foundation of everything that followed, of the art, the science, the cities, and the stories that would one day define the modern world. When night fell, they still knelt by their hearths to pray, thanking God for the day's bread and the safety of their children. They did not see themselves as living in an age of progress, They saw themselves as survivors, and perhaps that was truer. Yet in surviving, they had done more than endure. They had transformed. The dark had taught them to cherish light, and from that understanding, a new dawn spread slowly across the continent. It was not loud nor sudden. It was patient, golden, and deeply human, the long exhale of a world that had learned, after so much loss, to hope again. Part 14, The Return of the City. For centuries after the fall of Rome, Europe had been a landscape of fields and forests. Villages clung to rivers and valleys, small, self-contained worlds bound by soil and season. The memory of cities, of paved roads, marble forums, and markets filled with voices from every land lingered like a half-remembered dream. Then, slowly, that dream began to wake. By the 12th century, the silence of the Dark Ages was giving way to the murmur of trade. Carts creaked over cobblestones, bells rang from towers taller than any thatched roof. Streets that had once lain empty now thrummed with footsteps, laughter, and song. The city, long buried beneath fear and famine, had returned. The rebirth of urban life began not with kings, but with merchants. As roads improved and borders softened, trade routes reopened across the continent. The Mediterranean once more carried the sails of Genoa and Venice, Pisa and Amalfi, proud city republics whose wealth flowed from the sea.
Their ships brought spices from the Levant, silks from Constantinople, and glass from the workshops of the East. In the north, the merchants of Flanders and the Hanseatic League linked ports from Bruges to Lübeck, weaving a network of commerce that bound Europe together. Markets that had once lasted a single day became weekly fairs, then permanent centers of exchange. Cities grew around them like coral around a living reef. A fisherman's harbor became a marketplace, a monastery's gate became a street lined with stalls. Trade did what armies could not, it united. Gold and salt, wool and wine each carried not only goods but ideas, dialects, and faiths. The merchant replaced the knight as the symbol of power. His weapon was not the sword, but the ledger, his victories measured in profit and partnership. The rhythms of the new age were not set by the drum of war, but by the bells of the marketplace. The city became a meeting point between worlds, a place where a peasant could become a craftsman, where a craftsman could become a guildmaster, and where a man's skill mattered more than his birth. To survive, these new cities needed protection. Stone walls rose again, encircling crowded streets. Towers bristled above the skyline, not only as defenses, but as symbols of pride. Within the walls, narrow alleys twisted between timbered houses that leaned precariously toward each other, their upper stories nearly touching. Above, laundry fluttered between windows. Below, horses and carts jostled for space. The air was thick with the smell of bread, tanned leather, and smoke. Yet, amid this chaos, a remarkable order emerged. Towns were governed by charters, written promises that granted them rights to trade, self-rule, and justice. These documents, often purchased from kings or lords, gave birth to a new kind of freedom. Citizens, not nobles, decided their own laws through councils and guilds. The word burg, town, became a badge of identity. People called themselves burghers, proud not of noble ancestry, but of civic belonging. The architecture of the cities mirrored their ambition. Great town halls rose beside cathedrals, each competing for height and splendor. Stone bridges arched across rivers once forded by foot. Clock towers began to appear, the first public keepers of time, measuring not the church's hours of prayer, but the merchant's hours of trade.
The city was learning to keep its own rhythm. At the heart of every city were the guilds. These associations of craftsmen and merchants regulated quality, protected their members, and trained apprentices. Each trade had its saint, its banners, its festivals. Bakers marched beside masons, weavers beside goldsmiths, their parades filling the streets with color. To join a guild was to gain identity and security, to belong to something larger than oneself.
The guilds built hospitals, maintained roads, and sponsored altars in the churches that towered above their workshops. Through them, the idea of civic duty began to take root. The city was not just a place to live, but a community to serve. Pride in craftsmanship became a moral act. To make something well was to honor God.
Women found space in this new world too. Widows often inherited workshops or ran businesses in their husbands' stead. In the cloth towns of Flanders, they spun and dyed the threads that clothed half of Europe. In the Mediterranean ports, they managed shops and trade houses, keeping accounts as carefully as any merchant. The city, though far from equal, offered chances that the countryside rarely could. As the skyline rose, so too did the spirit. The same prosperity that filled markets also filled churches with offerings. Cathedrals became the pride of every city, vast structures of light and stone that took centuries to complete. Their spires seemed to pierce the clouds, their stained glass told the stories of saints and sinners alike. Each city poured its wealth into these monuments not merely as acts of devotion, but as declarations of identity. Inside their walls, faith and civic life intertwined. The bishop presided over souls, the mayor over streets, yet both shared the same sacred space. The ringing of the cathedral bells marked not only Mass, but market hours, curfews, and celebrations. Religion and daily life had never been so closely entwined, nor so public. Councils met beneath vaulted ceilings to decide matters of law, trade, and peace. Disputes that once ended with swords were now argued with words and sealed with seals. The rule of law, fragile but growing, found a home in the city hall. With prosperity came curiosity. Schools flourished beside cathedrals. Universities blossomed within city walls. Paris, Oxford, and Bologna became magnets for scholars. Streets once echoing with the clatter of carts now hummed with debate. Theology, philosophy, law, and medicine were studied side by side. Monks and laymen argued the nature of the universe, while vendors sold bread and ink outside their doors. Ideas traveled with traders. From the Arab world came mathematics, astronomy, and translations of Greek thought long lost to the West. The compass, the astrolabe, and new navigational charts expanded horizons once limited by fear. Knowledge, like commerce, ignored borders. The city became a crossroads of intellect as well as of goods. But every return brings its shadows. Cities bred not only wealth, but inequality. The narrow streets could turn deadly when fire or plague returned. Poverty crowded the outskirts, where the unskilled sought work that did not exist. Crime and corruption followed fortune as faithfully as pilgrims followed relics. Yet even in this, there was resilience. The same hands that built cathedrals built hospitals and orphanages. Religious orders such as the Franciscans walked barefoot through the slums, preaching compassion and tending the sick. The city's heart was divided, but it still beat strongly, a mixture of ambition and mercy, greed and grace. In these centuries, something subtle changed in the way people saw themselves. The old order had measured worth by birth. The new one began to measure it by ability. The merchant's courage, the craftsman's skill, the scholar's wit, these became the new virtues. The city taught people that destiny could be shaped by human hands. It was a lesson the world would not forget. And yet, even as towers rose and fortunes grew, humility remained. The people still remembered the long centuries of fear. They knew that plague or war could return at any time. Their faith remained their anchor. Churches filled at dawn and dusk, candles still burned before the Virgin, processions still wound through the streets on holy days. The New World did not abandon God. It sought to honor Him in every stone laid, every trade made, every song sung beneath the vaulted ceilings of the marketplace. Across Europe, each city developed its own soul. Venice shimmered on its lagoons, half land and half dream. Paris glittered with intellect and art. London grew around its river like a living tide. Cologne, Florence, Bruges, and countless others each blended faith and fortune in their own way. Together they formed a mosaic, a continent awakening from isolation into connection. At night their lights reflected in the rivers. The air smelled of bread and tallow, of wine and wet stone. From towers, bells marked the passing hours. It was a new kind of music, not the silence of monastic prayer, nor the clang of battle, but the steady hum of life continuing. The city had returned, and with it, the confidence to imagine a future. The return of the city was more than an economic revival. It was a transformation of the human spirit. It taught that cooperation could replace conquest, that law could temper power, and that beauty could rise from toil. It set in motion the ideas that would one day flower into humanism, science, and art, the very roots of the Renaissance. But to those who lived then, it was simply the joy of living once more among others, of hearing laughter in the streets, of sharing bread, of walking through gates that opened instead of closed. The city was community made visible, the echo of the old Roman dream renewed in medieval stone. When evening fell, the lamps were lit one by one. Merchants closed their stalls. Children fell asleep to the sound of distant bells. From high towers, watchmen called to one another across the rooftops, their voices fading into the night. Within the walls, thousands of lives intertwined, praying, building, loving, enduring. After centuries of silence, Europe's cities spoke again, in the language of trade, of art, of faith, and of hope. Their return marked not the end of the Dark Ages, but the moment when light became stronger than shadow. Part 15. The End of the Dark. The Middle Ages did not end in a single year, nor with a single event. They faded like night before dawn, as one light after another appeared on the horizon. The age of survival gave way to an age of creation, the age of faith to an age of curiosity. The world that had once clung to the memory of Rome now began to dream again, this time not of what had been lost, but of what might be found. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the changes that had long been gathering began to blossom in full. The towns that had once struggled for freedom became centers of art and learning. The universities of Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and Salamanca produced thinkers who questioned not only how the world was governed, but how it worked.
Latin remained the language of scholarship, but the ideas it carried grew broader: logic, medicine, astronomy, law. From the quiet scriptoria of monasteries, the written word spread into a new, public world.
Trade brought wealth, and with wealth came leisure, and with leisure, curiosity. Merchants who had once counted wool and spices began to count stars. Artists studied proportion, perspective, and the geometry of beauty. Architects refined the Gothic into forms that seemed to float, as though stone itself had learned to dream. Everywhere a sense of possibility flickered, small, uncertain, but undeniable. The rediscovery of the ancient world played its part. From the libraries of Byzantium and through the scholars of the Islamic world, the lost texts of Greece and Rome returned to Europe. The words of Aristotle, Galen, and Euclid, translated and studied, became the sparks that ignited a new fire. The wisdom that had once slept in parchment now awakened in the minds of men and women who saw no contradiction between faith and reason. The church remained the heart of medieval life, but its voice began to share the space it once filled alone. Monks still prayed in their cloisters, yet some now also observed the heavens. Theologians debated the mysteries of grace, while scholars experimented with optics, alchemy, and anatomy. Even the most devout began to sense that understanding creation was itself a form of worship.
Figures like Thomas Aquinas wrote of a world where divine truth and human reason could coexist. In his Summa Theologica, he sought to reconcile Aristotle's logic with the teachings of Christ, declaring that faith and intellect were not enemies but partners. His words, dense and deliberate, became a bridge between two ages, the medieval and the modern.
The monasteries, once Europe's libraries, now became its laboratories of thought. They preserved the past but also prepared the future. Their quiet patience had carried humanity through chaos. Now, that same patience allowed it to question, to test, to seek. The long habit of endurance became a habit of inquiry. Art changed first, as it often does. Painters began to look at the world not only as a mirror of heaven, but as a subject of wonder in itself. In the frescoes of Giotto, figures stood on real ground, their faces tender and individual. Light returned to painting, not symbolic light, but sunlight, falling softly on human skin. It was as if the divine had moved closer, stepping into the ordinary world. In sculpture and architecture, the same spirit appeared. Cathedrals that had once reached upward in solemn awe now also opened outward, filled with laughter, music, and color. Festivals turned the streets into theaters of faith and joy. Humanity was learning to celebrate itself again, not in pride, but in gratitude for existence. Even language changed. Poets began to write in the tongues people spoke, not only in Latin. Dante wrote his Divine Comedy in the Italian of Florence. Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales in the English of London. For the first time in centuries, ordinary people could hear poetry in their own words and recognize themselves within it. The idea of the individual, once buried beneath collective identity, began to awaken. In workshops and shipyards, practical minds translated thought into motion. The compass guided sailors far from familiar coasts. The astrolabe mapped the heavens. Engineers experimented with water wheels, windmills, and the first mechanical clocks. The harnessing of time, once kept only by church bells, became a science. And then, in the mid-15th century, a German craftsman named Johannes Gutenberg perfected a machine that would change the world, the printing press. With it, the labor of a lifetime could be multiplied 100-fold. Books that once took years to copy could now be produced in days. Knowledge leapt from monastery to market, from scholar to merchant, from city to city. The written word became a living river, and no wall could contain it. The press was the final breath of the medieval age and the first of the modern. Exploration followed thought. Mariners from Portugal and Spain began to test the edges of the known world. They sailed down the coast of Africa, across to the islands of the Atlantic, and eventually beyond the sunset toward lands unimagined. The curiosity that had begun in the cloister now filled the sails of ships. The same spirit that had once built cathedrals now sought the edge of the world. And yet, even in this surge of light, the memory of the darkness remained. The Middle Ages were not forgotten or despised by those who followed. They were honored as roots are honored by the tree they sustain. The Renaissance did not appear in rebellion but in gratitude. The scholars of Florence, Paris, and Oxford all stood on the shoulders of monks who had copied by candlelight. The masons who designed domes and arches had learned from the craftsmen who built cathedrals. The humanists who praised reason had been shaped by faith. The age of discovery owed its compass to centuries of endurance. To call those earlier centuries dark is to misunderstand them. They were dark only as soil is dark, rich, hidden, and full of the seeds of what would come. The wars, the plagues, the prayers, the long silence of survival, all were part of a slow alchemy that transformed despair into resilience. The dawn of the Renaissance was not the rejection of the Middle Ages, but their fulfillment. By the 15th century, Europe was changing faster than any generation before it could comprehend. Cities thrived, trade spanned oceans, art and science intertwined. The old feudal bonds loosened, replaced by new economies of skill and intellect. The church still stood at the center, but its voice now shared the air with a chorus of others: princes, poets, philosophers, explorers. In Italy, Leonardo da Vinci studied the flight of birds, the anatomy of man, and the mechanics of the universe. In Germany, scholars debated the reform of faith itself. In every workshop and library, there was a quiet sense that the world was opening, that the age of endurance had become the age of inquiry. And yet, even amid all this brightness, something of the medieval spirit endured: its humility, its devotion, its sense of wonder. The people of the New Age still knelt in churches lit by candlelight, still looked to the stars and saw the hand of the divine. They did not abandon the sacred, they sought to understand it more deeply. The faith of the Middle Ages had given birth to the curiosity of the modern world. When historians later named these centuries the Renaissance, they imagined a clean division: darkness followed by light. But the truth was softer, more human. The dawn did not erase the night, it completed it. The two were part of the same sky. The people who lived through this turning point did not see themselves as modern or medieval. They were simply alive, building cathedrals, sailing new seas, painting faces that seemed to breathe. Their world was changing, but they moved through it with the same mixture of fear and hope that had carried their ancestors through the plagues and wars. The difference was that now, hope was stronger. In the workshops of Florence, in the universities of Paris, in the shipyards of Lisbon, a single thought bound them all: that the world was knowable, beautiful, and worth exploring. It was the quiet triumph of centuries of struggle, the victory of persistence over despair. When we speak of the end of the Dark Ages, we speak of more than history. We speak of the human spirit learning once again to look outward and upward. The light that spread across Europe did not come from conquest or invention alone. It came from the endurance of countless ordinary people: the monks who copied, the mothers who prayed, the builders who laid stones one by one. Their faith, their patience, their longing for meaning had kept the flame alive through centuries of shadow. And so the darkness ended not with a shout, but with a whisper, the whisper of pens on paper, of sails catching wind, of bells ringing over cities reborn. It ended when humanity remembered that knowledge and beauty were not luxuries, but forms of praise. The world turned. The age of faith became the age of reason. The long night gave way to day. And yet, the light that rose over Europe was not new. It was the same flame that had burned quietly all along, guarded by those who believed through every storm that morning would come. And so the story of the Dark Ages comes to rest. From the ashes of empires and the silence of forgotten roads, humanity found its way forward, step by step, prayer by prayer, word by word. The centuries that once seemed lost were not empty after all. They were a bridge, built slowly by hands that refused to let the light go out. The bells that once tolled for plague now ring for peace. The same stars that watched over peasants and kings still shine above us tonight. Their glow reminds us that history's darkness is never complete, that even in hardship, there are always candles burning somewhere in the distance. Thank you for walking through this quiet history, for listening to the echoes of faith, endurance, and hope that carried our ancestors from shadow into dawn. As you rest now, may that same calm light keep you company. May you drift into sleep knowing that every age, no matter how dim, carries its own kind of grace. Good night, and may the light within the dark guide your dreams.